Cheryl was my daughter, my firstborn. I called her Sherry from the time she was born. She was always a mama's girl.
We were about 4 years apart. We always got along, even though there was a big age gap. She would play Barbies with me.
Cheryl Lynn Gilly Hall was born on June 22, 1961, in Aurora, Kane County, Illinois, USA. She was a joyful girl who always had a smile on her face. Sherry, as she was lovingly known, carried those traits into her adulthood as well. 20-year-old Cheryl tied the knot with Chuck Hall, the love of her life, in 1981. Their wedding day, a symbol of new beginnings, was adorned with the innocence and charm brought by the adorable flower girl, Jackie Stiles, Chuck's sister.
Chuck and Cheryl met through a mutual friend and just hit it off right away.
I think it's the first time she fell in love. I mean, she had other boyfriends, but she knew Chuck was the one. All she wanted to do was get married and start a family.
October 6, 1979, Chuck and Cheryl were married. I was the flower girl. I got to wear the pretty dress. My brother, I had never seen him happier.
It was a day that marked the start of their journey together in a serene and welcoming Aurora neighborhood, enveloped by the warmth of their supportive network of family and friends. Cheryl was not just a wife, but also a beloved daughter and sister. She shared a deep bond with her younger sister, Lisa Martinez. Despite their significant age difference, the two siblings were inseparable, spending countless hours together engaged in playful activities like playing with Barbies. Cheryl and Chuck had built a life filled with love and promise, their union marked by joyous milestones and cherished memories. Their tastefully decorated townhome served as the backdrop for countless gatherings, where laughter and love intertwined to create lasting memories. Amidst their shared happiness, Cheryl dedicated her Wednesdays to completing her household chores and taking care of their home, ensuring a haven of comfort and serenity for their family. It was a well-known routine among their circle that Cheryl would be at home all day, while Chuck went off to work, returning home for lunch, a cherished opportunity for the couple to savor moments of quality time together. However, a tragedy struck on September 9, 1981, when the love-bound couple met a horrific fate. When Chuck returned home, he unveiled a scene that would leave him traumatized for the rest of his life. Concerned by the out-of-place items near the front door and the toppled laundry, Chuck called out for Cheryl, only to be met with silence. He went up the stairs looking for Cheryl, and his heart sank as he stumbled upon the unimaginable sight of Cheryl hanging from the doorknob with an iron cord around her neck. In a desperate bid to save his beloved wife, Chuck sprang into action and attempted CPR with all his might. Overwhelmed by shock and grief, he sought help from their neighbor, a nurse, whose swift response in calling for medical assistance and the police offered a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. Despite the anguish gripping his heart, Chuck stayed hopeful and continued his efforts to revive Cheryl until the paramedics arrived. However, it was too late even for the paramedics to do anything, and Cheryl was pronounced dead.
You have to look at the husband first because he's the closest one, and that's tough because they're grieving at the loss of a loved one.
As is customary in any investigation, authorities initially thought of Chuck, Cheryl's husband, as the primary suspect, given his close relations to Cheryl as her husband and being the last person to see her alive. Chuck fit the profile of the prime suspect. This reality was a harsh blow for Chuck, who was already grappling with the profound grief of losing his beloved wife.
Not only was Chuck his spouse, he was also the last person to see her alive, and he was the one who found her body. So he fit all three criteria of what would make the number one suspect.
Denise Crosby, a columnist at the Chicago Tribune, collaborated with the detective on the case and highlighted the complexities of investigating a case where the grieving spouse was also a suspect. Despite his deep love for Cheryl, Chuck endured hours of grueling interrogation as investigators sought to verify his account of events. The police had to explore all possible angles.
Chuck went through many, many hours of questioning. They would go over his story again and again and again, and it took a toll on him.
Chuck was very angry with the police department because in his mind, He loved this woman so much. How could you ever consider me as a suspect?
However, upon investigating Chuck's whereabouts between 2:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. on the day of the murder, he was eventually ruled out as a suspect.
It never crossed my mind that Chuck ever hurt her. Never crossed my mind.
We spoke with Chuck, who obviously said that he was working that day. We checked into his whereabouts between 2:30 and 6 p.m. and confirmed that he was seen on jobs.
Investigators thoroughly searched the crime scene for any potential evidence that could lead to the actual perpetrator. Items such as Cheryl's purse and door handles were collected in the hopes of finding latent fingerprints. Unfortunately, many of the fingerprints were either smudged or overlaid, which posed a big challenge in identifying them. During Cheryl's autopsy, the coroner made a significant discovery. There was a bloodstain under one of her fingernails. This finding hinted towards the possibility that the murderer was in close proximity to Cheryl during the struggle, offering a potential clue in the ongoing investigation. Cheryl's sister recalled having a conversation with her on the phone at around 3 p.m. on September 9, 1981, the day of her tragic death. Subsequently, at approximately 3:30 p.m., neighbors reported hearing a loud door slam, followed by several disturbing thuds. It wasn't until 6 p.m. that Chuck returned home to discover Cheryl's lifeless body. The attorney involved in the case shared that one of the initial steps in the investigation was to consider the possibility of a break-in at Cheryl Lynn's residence, followed by a confrontation with the perpetrator that eventually led to her tragic murder. The detective assigned to the case confirmed that the Halls had recently installed a deadbolt on the door, which remained intact during the investigation. Furthermore, there were no signs of disturbance or missing items of significant value within Cheryl's apartment. This added to the mystery surrounding her untimely demise. Now that Chuck was no longer a suspect, the detectives zeroed in on Larry Galloway, a close friend of Chuck and Cheryl. Larry and Cheryl had known each other since high school and both worked at the same cable company as Chuck. Although they occasionally socialized, Cheryl had felt uneasy around Galloway during his visit to her home 2 weeks before her tragic death. She confided in a friend about this uneasy experience, and the friend revealed this information to the detectives during the investigation into Cheryl's murder. This immediately put a noose of suspicion around Larry's neck. Larry cooperated with the authorities and provided details about his whereabouts and relationship with Cheryl and her husband. He claimed to have been alone mowing his parents' lawn during the time of the murder and stated that he had visited Cheryl's home to discuss union matters with Chuck, who served as a union steward. Interestingly, Chuck had played a role in saving Galloway's job at the cable company through the union. Despite this information, the police were unable to gather further leads from Galloway, and the case remained unsolved. There was no concrete evidence implicating Galloway in the murder. However, the unexpected visit and the uneasy interaction with Cheryl raised questions that seemed to warrant further investigation into his possible involvement in the tragic events. After Larry Galloway refused to cooperate and Chuck was cleared as a suspect, the investigation reached a standstill. Cheryl's mother, Garnet, took matters into her own hands and called Larry, warning him of the consequences of his actions. However, Larry responded callously, hanging up on Garnet. This deeply angered Garnet, as Larry displayed no concern or remorse for Cheryl's fate. Despite Garnet's frustration, the police were unable to gather any further information, evidence, or leads in the case, leaving the investigation at a standstill and the case cold. In 1997, a crucial development hindered the progress of the investigation. With the emergence of technology and DNA advancements, there was hope of gathering crucial DNA evidence. However, Larry Galloway refused to provide a DNA sample to the police. Prosecutors escalated the case to a grand jury, which issued a subpoena ordering Galloway to provide the DNA sample. Unfortunately, Larry's lawyers appealed the order, leading to a judge's ruling that there was insufficient evidence to compel Larry to provide the sample. This decision prevented the collection of crucial evidence that could have potentially led to justice for Cheryl Lynn Hall's murder. In 2008, with a decade of law enforcement experience, Detective David Ferrelli from the Aurora Police Department had a hunch about who could have murdered Cheryl Lynn Hall. He believed that Larry Galloway was undoubtedly a person of interest and held the key to solving the mystery. Dan decided to take action by setting up surveillance on Larry's residence. He patiently waited for over 2 hours until Larry emerged with another individual.
He drove to the Chili's restaurant. We maintained a visual on him while he was eating his meal. After he left the restaurant, that's when we went up to the table to collect his straw and utensils and napkin. The swabbing from the straw matched the bloodstain under her fingernails. This was the break that the case needed. This was what the family had been waiting for.
Finally, Larry was charged and arrested with Cheryl's murder on July 31st, 2008. Despite Larry's arrest, he displayed no emotional response and cooperated with the police. On top of that, during questioning, he showed no remorse for his actions. Building a strong case against Galloway posed a major challenge for prosecutors, particularly due to the volume of DNA recovered from the crime scene, which raised concerns about potential inconsistencies. Although the case relied heavily on DNA evidence, prosecutors recognized that it was not airtight. As a result, a plea agreement was reached to hold Galloway accountable for his actions to the fullest extent possible, based on the available evidence. On Monday, April 23, 2012, 52-year-old Larry pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a 10-year sentence for the murder of Cheryl Lynn Hall. He would be eligible for parole in 5 years. Despite the obstacles and challenges faced by prosecutors, justice was served for Cheryl Hall, bringing a sense of closure to her family. However, the motive behind Larry's heinous act remained a mystery, leaving unanswered questions about why he would harm Cheryl. This senseless act of violence has left Cheryl's family and the community shocked and outraged, adding to their pain. But there was a sense of closure and peace in knowing that Larry would now pay for his crime and be locked up for the next 10 years of his life. Sadly, just 3 years later, on December 23, 2015, Cheryl's family received yet other news that shattered their faith in justice when they were told that Larry was already walking free. It turned out that while Larry was imprisoned at the Illinois Department of Corrections, he took anger management classes and was given credit for it, which further reduced his already short sentence. Larry's release from jail after serving only a fraction of his sentence dealt another devastating blow to Cheryl's loved ones, who had been tirelessly seeking justice for her. Tragically, just a few months later, Chuck Hall, Cheryl's widower, succumbed to the cancer he had been fighting. Despite the unimaginable pain and loss, Chuck found comfort in knowing that the truth had been revealed and that his name had been cleared. The family can now take solace in the fact that the world knows the truth about Chuck and Cheryl's tragic story, allowing them to finally begin the healing process. This case serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of justice and accountability in our society, and underscores the significance of supporting those who have suffered such profound loss.
In memory of Andrew L. Muns, Ensign, U.S. Navy, Vietnam, October 12, 1943, January 17, 1968.
In the turbulent years of 1968, amidst the backdrop of the Vietnam War and the constant flux of military operations, 24-year-old Andrew Lee Muns found himself in a pivotal role as the newly appointed paymaster aboard the USS Kacapin, a T-3 Cimarron-class fleet oiler stationed at Subic Bay in the Philippines, a crucial forward staging area for the American forces in Vietnam. Andrew was entrusted with significant responsibilities aboard the refueling ship. On the fateful night of January 17, 1968, Andrew was seen around 2 a.m., making his way above deck towards his office. Sadly, that was the last time anyone saw him alive. Hours later, when Andrew failed to report for muster, the morning assembly at 8 in the morning, concern began to mount among his fellow sailors. Checking each and every room, everyone looked for Andrew on the ship, but he was nowhere to be found. When they checked the dispersing office of the ship, they were met with the sight of betrayal. The ship's safe was found open, and an alarming $8,600 was found to be missing. This cast a shadow of suspicion over Andrew's sudden disappearance. Yet a puzzling question lingered. Was Andrew a victim of foul play, Or had he really cheated his fellow sailors and fled the ship with that large sum of money? When the ship eventually arrived at shore, Ray McGady, a special agent from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, looked into Andrew's mysterious disappearance and the alleged theft.
He gave me a 3x5 card basically telling me that they are missing a dispersing officer and missing funds from the dispersing office safe. It brought some suspicion as to what happened to the $8,600 that was in the safe at that time. Was he a victim of foul play, or did he take the money and run?
Although the detectives completed a brief investigation, there didn't seem to be any signs of foul play. Hence, the authorities, as well as Andrew's fellow sailors, swiftly pointed fingers at him. Andrew was labeled as a thief and backstabber, and his name was left tarnished. And with this conclusion, the case of Andrew's disappearance was marked closed. This controversial end to Andrew's case took a heavy toll on the Muns family. They knew deep down that Andrew could not have done such a thing. However, a slight sense of uncertainty always kept them from fully learning what happened to their beloved Andrew on the night of January 17, 1968. The pain inflicted by the unsolved mystery was undeniable for the Muns family. And just 3 years after Andrew's disappearance, his father, Franz Henry Muns, suffered a sudden heart attack and passed away without having a chance to clear his son's name. Even though Andrew's case had been lying cold for 3 years, Andrew's sister, Mary Lou Taylor, refused to accept the official report surrounding her brother's fate. Driven by a fierce determination to uncover the truth and restore her family's honor, Mary embarked on a tireless quest that spanned decades. During the mid-1970s, as the passage of time dulled a glimmer of hope for the Muns family that Andrew would even return home, they reluctantly made the decision to have him declared legally deceased. Yet amidst the sorrow that shrouded their hearts, they sought to honor his memory with a fitting tribute, a memorial service befitting of a cherished loved one. However, their request for an American flag from the Navy to adorn his memorial was met with a cold refusal, leaving them disheartened and shamed. In a cruel response to the Muns family plea, the Navy dismissed the request with a rude declaration that such honors were reserved solely for those with honorable discharges. This only deepened the wounds of the Muns family and denied them any closure. They were left without answers, without a body, and without an honorable end to their grief. Years went by, but the pain and suffering the Muns family endured never faded away. Determined to unravel the mystery that had haunted her family for such a long time, Andrew's sister Mary embarked on a quest for truth to clear her brother's name. This led Mary to the vast expanse of the internet in the mid-1990s. With a glimmer of hope, she cast a digital net and posted an emotional response on a Vietnam veterans message board to seek out those who had served alongside her brother aboard the Kekapin. In a twist of fate around 1998, her cry for help caught the attention of Tim Rosaire, a former crew member of the ship who had recently stumbled upon the bulletin board and seen Mary's message about Andrew. Rosaire was the ship's journalist during Andrew's tenure. He had shared strong recollections of his interactions with Andrew and even told Mary that he believed that Andrew was innocent. Throughout their conversation, Rosaire supplied Mary with invaluable insights and even offered names and photographs of fellow crew members, thus giving her new avenues to look into in her quest for answers. Armed with newfound leads, Mary delved deeper into the labyrinth of her brother's disappearance and uncovered unsettling discrepancies in the Navy's initial investigation reports. Mary didn't believe even for a moment that Andrew would give up his position in the Navy for a mere $8,600. This painted a distorted narrative of suspicious accounts and fabricated motives, fueling Mary's conviction that her brother's vanishing act was veiled in deceit. Furthermore, the puzzling angle of the missing funds was starting to look more and more like a facade. Andrew's involvement with the missing funds was not making sense anymore, as a staggering amount of $51,000 had remained untouched in the safe. Mary couldn't help but wonder that if Andrew really did steal $8,600 and abandon the ship, then why hadn't he taken the rest of the money in the safe as well? The inexplicable decision to leave behind such a large sum defied logic and challenged the very foundation of the Navy's conclusions. Despite the obstacles and uncertainties that dotted her path, Mary remained resolute in her search for truth and kept investigating Andrew's disappearance herself. With the strong desire to unearth the truth, bring justice and restore Andrew's honor, the Muns family yearned for the reopening of the case. However, they faced a daunting hurdle as the Navy insisted on substantial new evidence before considering such a request. Mary's journey led her to an unexpected ally who went by the name Ray McGady. Ray was the agent who had handled the original investigation into Andrew's disappearance for the Naval Investigative Service. Even though Ray had retired and was living a peaceful life in North Carolina, he agreed to help Mary with her investigation. He was able to vividly recall the intricate details of Andrew's disappearance and even expressed a level of familiarity that surpassed that of any other case he had worked on in his career. Clearly, Andrew's case stuck with him for some reason. Empowered by Ray's support and equipped with enough proof of discrepancies in the original investigation, Mary decided to reach out to the authorities to get Andrew's case reopened. She caught the attention of Pete Hughes, the leader of the newly established Cold Case Squad at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. When going through the case file, Pete agreed that there were a number of questions that remained unanswered. He recognized the gravity of the unresolved questions lingering over the case and was compelled to dive deeper into the mystery. And later, in 1998, a case that had long eluded closure reopened and a fresh investigation was on its way. With Pete overlooking the investigation, there was a shift in perspective as the case was now being treated as a potential homicide and not theft. Pete put together a team of seasoned homicide investigators, complemented by the insights of a skilled criminal profiler, to closely examine the decade-old statements. The cold case team began the process of re-interviewing crew members trying to find any information that might have been overlooked during the original investigation almost 30 years ago. Ray and Pete's help proved invaluable for Mary as they lent their expertise and resources to Mary's cause. There was a glimmer of hope in her pursuit of justice. During the summer of 2000, as the investigation deepened, suspicion gradually honed in on several former crew members. One of these crew members was Michael LeBrun, who stood out from the rest and caught the detectives' attention. At this time of this renewed investigation, Michael was living outside Kansas City, Missouri, and was working in the real estate sector. Michael's past in the dispersing office, working alongside Andrew in 1968, raised eyebrows. It turned out that apart from Andrew, Michael too had access to the ship's safe. After being among the first ones to speculate that Andrew had stolen the money and deserted the ship, Michael found himself under scrutiny. However, this information was not enough to get a solid conclusion. The most challenging thing about the case was the absence of a body or any physical evidence. Pete thought that to build a case, securing a confession from LeBrun was necessary, and so Michael was called in for a round of interrogation in the fall of 2000.
The strategy is to go for broke. Either secure a confession or drop the case against LeBrun.
All right, I know you're responsible for Ensign Muns. Yeah, I know that. We can show that. The only issue is did it happen in a split second and that you planned out?
So premeditation, or was it spontaneous? That's the one question. Quite frankly, I think it's premeditation.
Pete devised a strategic approach. He told Michael that they knew there was foul play from his end. They only wanted to know whether it was premeditated or not. If it was not, then he would not have anything to worry about, since there was a statute of limitations on spontaneous acts. However, this was a lie. Michael took the bait, and following a series of a few more interviews, his stance started to shake. Gradually, Michael's resolve waned, and he disclosed intricate details of the heinous crime he claimed to have committed.
The statute of limitations regarding spontaneous act.
I thought there was no statute of limitations on homicide.
It depends on how the act was completed.
I never intended to kill anybody. I never have planned to kill anybody.
Okay.
I've never premeditated to kill anybody.
But it happened with Andy Muns. Isn't that right?
I'm here to tell you there was no premeditation.
All right.
It was spontaneous.
Okay.
Well, once LeBrun thought he wasn't going to be prosecuted because he committed what he perceived was a manslaughter, he decided to go ahead and confess.
My killing Andy Muns was not intentional. There was no intent on my part to kill him. I don't recall the exact time that I killed
Tell us why you killed him. Again, tell us what we already know.
Self-preservation. To protect myself from being caught.
Being caught.
Being caught, messing in the safe.
Andy Muns saw him do that, and Andy Muns said, okay, now I've got you, you're on report. And that's when that intent of premeditation came in, right then. It only takes seconds to form intent. And that's when he knew he had to kill him or go to the brig. And that's what he told us. Safe doors open.
None of this is premeditated. None of this, I see, all of a sudden I see the safe door open, and it's kind of like, oh, gee, I open the safe, I look, start
According to Michael's account, he admitted to strangling Muns after being caught stealing money from the safe, succumbing to panic in the heart of the moment. To conceal his actions, Michael hastily resorted to disposing of Andrew's body in one of the ship's vast muck tanks, leaving behind no trace of the horrific deed.
What are you doing?
What are you doing?
And I just
All right, show him how you grab him, please. How'd you grab him?
grab it.
What does he do?
He grabs back.
Where do I grab you?
I don't know, you just grab.
Grab.
And then I just kind of like, we can't, no, you can't, I'm blurred here. I can't do this. I can't see this. You can't tell anybody. And boom, boom, boom. No, this can't happen. Leave me alone. I can't have this. Whatever. I don't recall exactly what I'm saying. I'm just panicked. I was struggling. He's kicking. He's pushing. But
Okay, well, what stops him from doing that?
I'm stronger than he is.
Right.
Killing beast. What am I gonna do? My first thought was I gotta get rid of this body, throw it over the side. I went out to the well deck and thought, this will be a splash, it'll float. I'm deep here, I've got this. What am I gonna do? Tank. Remember we mucked tanks when I was on Mattapanai.
What does that mean, muck tanks?
Oh, we went down and cleaned them out.
Cleaned them out.
They never go in these tanks for a year and a half.
And then he had to figure out what to do with the body and what to do with the money. Why throw away $8,600? Why not just keep it? Well, LeBron, already starting to figure out how I need to cover this crime up, was thinking about latent impressions. Hey, my fingerprints are on this money. I need to get rid of this money.
The pivotal interview, captured on videotape, marked a critical turning point in the investigation. However, the detectives still needed to know whether Michael's actions were premeditated or not, as it was essential to the case. Pete brought Mary to accompany him to the next interview with Michael, aiming to use her presence as a catalyst for breaking down Michael's defenses.
After he confesses to the NCIS agents, Mary Lou Taylor, Andy Muns' sister, is brought in.
I've come to realize that I was responsible for Andy's death. And I'm sorry to you for that.
It was awkward for me because it felt like I was supposed to say, there, that's okay. But it's not okay. He killed my brother. And so just confessing isn't okay.
It's something that I haven't even been willing to face for the last 30-some years. And I don't know what else to say. It's just, I'm so sorry.
It was hard to say, oh yeah, I understand. I didn't understand. He killed my brother because he was stealing money and he got caught. I don't understand that.
I'm glad to be able to lay this to rest.
I'm glad it's for you and Annie. And it's partially laid to rest for me, but it's not done yet.
At the end, when we were leaving, and he said, may I give you a hug? I forget his exact words, but it was something like, can I hug you, or may I give you a hug? I was totally taken aback, and I certainly wasn't ready to say, oh, sure.
I'm sorry. Can I give you a hug? Is that okay?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. I mean,
The detectives did not immediately arrest Michael. Instead, he was allowed to go home, probably thinking he had gotten away with murder.
He believed that he could only be charged with a manslaughter charge. I'm convinced of that. He thought that he was going to get a pass on this.
Matt Whitworth is a deputy U.S. attorney in Kansas City. In the fall of 2000, he reviews Michael LeBron's taped confession and concludes the suspect could be prosecuted, not for manslaughter, but for felony murder. There are, however, some problems.
My first concern that I had was I knew that they had inflated or misled him in concerning the amount of evidence they had that implicated him in the crime.
I know you're responsible for Ensign Muns. Yeah, I know that. We can show that.
Did we push the envelope a little bit in there? Sure. I mean, this is a murder. We're talking to somebody we strongly suspect committed a murder.
Finally, decades after Andrew's murder, Mary's unwavering commitment bore fruit, with a stunning revelation that brought the whole truth out. The shocking confession from Michael shed new light on the circumstances surrounding Andrew's disappearance and offered a glimmer of solace to his grieving family. As the truth gradually unfolded, Andrew's name was cleared of all the shame and doubt it had been linked to earlier. However, Mary's battle wasn't over just yet. Subsequently charged with murder, Michael entered a plea of not guilty and was released on bail pending further legal proceedings. But that wasn't all Michael did. He also contested the veracity of the agent's claims. Michael alleged that he was coerced into confessing to the murder during the interrogation process. He accused the investigators of employing intense psychological tactics and fabricating evidence against him. In the face of mounting accusations, Michael painted a picture of duress and manipulation, trying to convince everyone that he was innocent. But this didn't trouble Pete and the prosecutors. This was a fight they were willing to take on. Amidst the looming fear of being prosecuted, Michael found himself confronted with a stark choice.
You never yelled at him. You never, had your guns out, or there were no weapons present. There was never any physical force. Or
Told him he was going to go
threats.
home several times.
And we took him home.
And he went home.
As a prosecutor, if I had agents in an interview lying about what the law was, then I would take I don't think I'd file a case, because there's a fairness issue there that I would have to take into consideration. But that wasn't the case here. They didn't mislead him about what the law was.
He could either risk wrongful conviction and financial ruin, or confess to a lesser offense on which the statute of limitation had run out and would not be prosecuted. Following a legal development, U.S. District Judge Dean Whipple handled a partial decision. He ruled that the prosecutors would not be allowed to utilize the videotaped confession obtained from Michael due to the violations of his constitutional rights. In a detailed ruling, Judge Whipple said, although Michael had been informed of his rights during preceding interrogation rounds, the final interview where he made the actual confession lacked the necessary advice. Notably, Judge Whipple got the impression that federal agents had systematically used excessive pressure on Michael, knowingly resorting to falsehoods regarding incriminating evidence. Moreover, the judge observed the federal agents even assured Michael that he would be immune from prosecution if he confessed to manslaughter. This further complicated matters for the prosecution to prove Michael's involvement in Andrew's murder. In the absence of a legally sound and verifiable confession, the prosecutors found themselves confronted with a considerable setback, potentially undermining the viability of their case. Ready to file an appeal of the confession ruling, Detective Pete Hughes signaled towards a continued legal battle ahead. This battle went on for another 5 years until September 2005, when 60-year-old Michael finally pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter for killing 24-year-old Andrew Lee Muns on January 17, 1968. A few months later, on March 24, 2006, more than 38 years after murdering Andrew, Michael was sentenced to 4 years in prison. After years of struggle, Mary expressed she finally achieved the closure she had sought. Remarkably, her quest was not driven by a desire to see Michael face legal consequences. Rather, she viewed his internal struggle over the decades as a form of retribution, whether consciously acknowledged or not. June 8, 2001 marked a significant milestone in Mary's life. As 33 years after Andrew's disappearance, the Navy held a funeral service for Andrew with full military honors. This somber yet dignified occasion took place at the Arlington National Cemetery and drew together a gathering of over 200 people. Friends, family, and naval investigators from across the nation came together to remember Andrew and acknowledged his unwavering dedication to the Navy and his nation. Notably, this solemn ceremony marked a pivotal shift in Andrew's status, as he was no longer labeled as a deserter. Reflecting on the emotional significance of the event, Mary conveyed an emotional statement. She only wished that her parents could have experienced this dignified farewell over 3 decades ago. With profound pride, she honored her brother's memory, highlighting his strong sense of honor and integrity that defied his character. Moving on to the next case, our focus shifts to Kansas City, Missouri. It was here that Fawn Marie Coz was born into a close-knit family on February 15, 1973. Fawn was a winter baby, and her life unfolded in the heart of Kansas City. As the third child in the Cox family, she grew up surrounded by the love of her parents, Beverly and Donald Cox, and her 2 younger sisters, Felicia and Amber. Fawn's early years were marked by the typical joys of childhood in a supportive household. Growing up, Fawn attended Northeast High School, where she was known for her amiable nature and genuine warmth that endeared her to her classmates and teachers alike. As a teenager, 16-year-old Fawn took on a part-time job as a cashier at Worlds of Fun, a local amusement park where she began to earn her own money and be more independent. Despite the responsibilities of work and school, Fawn maintained a strong sense of connection with her family, always returning home after her shift to the embrace of her loved ones. June 26, 1989 was like any other night for the Cox family. Fawn's mother, Beverly, and her youngest sister, Felicia, fell asleep peacefully downstairs, but little did they know that tragedy was about to strike in the stillness of the night. On that fateful night, someone entered 16-year-old Fawn's bedroom through the window, shattering the tranquility of their home. Fawn, asleep in her bed, became the victim of a heinous crime that would remain unsolved for decades. The intruder subjected Fawn to an assault and then committed the ultimate act of violence, strangling her in her own bed. The cruelty of the crime was worsened by the fact that the rest of the family remained oblivious to the horror, unfolding just a room away. As Fawn's alarm went off in the morning, signaling a start of a new day, her family discovered the grim reality that awaited them. Fawn's absence in the morning light sent shockwaves through the Cox family. It was Felicia who found her lifeless sister, a discovery that would forever haunt her. The air conditioner's hum had masked the sounds of the crime, allowing the assailant to enter and leave undetected. Fawn's dreams and aspirations were extinguished in the silence of that night, leaving behind a family shattered by grief and a community startled with an unsolved mystery. In the aftermath of Fawn's murder, the Kansas City Police Department launched an extensive investigation. Crime scene investigators diligently collected bodily fluids from the crime scene, hoping that one-day advancements in forensic technology would bring justice to the Cox family. But little did they know that the answers would remain elusive for over 3 decades, leaving the family in a state of perpetual uncertainty. Now, the person behind the crime seemed to have disappeared, leaving the detectives dealing with the challenges of a poor and crime-filled neighborhood. Despite feeling frustrated and facing dead ends, the detectives kept going, determined to find out what really happened. After a tough month, a breakthrough happened. A witness came forward, pointing the police toward 3 teenagers, one of whom knew Fawn from school. This new lead gave the investigation a boost, as the witnesses shared important details that the police hadn't revealed. The 9th Street Dog Gang became a big focus, and 3 members, Christopher Yeats, Timothy Roberts, and Leonard Crusius, were suspected and charged in Fawn's case. In August 1989, 18-year-old Christopher Yeats was charged with second-degree murder. Timothy Roberts, also 18 years old, faced first-degree murder charges, and 16-year-old Leonard Crusius was charged with burglary in December 1989. The police identified the 3 teenagers who were later charged with murder. The leads that led to their arrest initially seemed promising. Stolen items from Fawn's room were found in one of the suspects' home, and the evidence was strong enough to file murder charges against them. However, the investigation took an unexpected turn when the main witness suddenly changed their story and stopped helping the police. This setback, combined with the fact that DNA evidence did not match with any of the suspects, created significant obstacles for the detectives. The case became even more complicated as the police struggled to definitively identify any other suspects, and eventually all 3 were released and their names were cleared. After this, due to a lack of leads to follow up on, the case went cold. In the early 2000s, the police decided to reopen the investigation, hoping that advances in DNA analysis could provide new leads. With optimism and scientific progress, the police uploaded DNA samples from the crime scene to the comprehensive database. The goal was clear: to find the hidden killer after more than a decade. The process of uploading DNA samples to the database was a big step forward in forensic science. The database, which stored genetic information from individuals involved in various crime cases, was a tool that investigators hoped would solve the mysteries around Fawn's murder. The expectations were high, but unfortunately there were no matches found in the DNA profile of Fawn's killer. The frustration within the investigative team grew as the case seemed to hit a standstill once again. Over the years, theories emerged and suspects were considered, but the lack of conclusive evidence kept the case cold. It wasn't until the advent of advanced genetic genealogy techniques that a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. On November 11, 2020, the Kansas City Police Department, in collaboration with the local FBI field office, harnessed the power of modern DNA analysis to re-examine Fawn's case. The utilization of cutting-edge technology, similar to that employed in solving the Golden State Killer case, marked a turning point in the investigation. The advanced DNA testing revealed a breakthrough: the identification of the perpetrator, who had eluded justice for over 3 decades. The shocking revelation pointed to someone close to the Cox family. The killer was identified as Donald Cox Jr., who was Fawn's own cousin. At the time of the murder, Donald was 21 years old, and the chilling truth emerged that he had violated the trust of his family bonds in the most egregious manner possible. While the discovery brought closure to the investigation, it also opened wounds that had remained hidden for years. Donald Cox Jr.'s death in 2006, caused due to a drug overdose, meant that he would never face the consequences of his actions in the court of law. In November 2020, investigators conveyed the shocking findings to Fawn's still living parents, Beverly and Donald Cox. The news elicited a mix of sorrow and relief: sorrow for the loss of a beloved daughter, and relief that the long-standing investigation was finally finished.
This is what every investigator, every detective works for, is this day when they can sit down with a family member of a murder victim and tell them that definitively who is responsible for their loved one's death. It doesn't bring that person back. In this case, we don't even get to bring that person to justice because they died years ago. But it brings that closure for that family.
The revelation of a family member's involvement added a layer of complexity to the Cox family's grief. The comfort of finally knowing who was behind this the whole time clashed with the pain of discovering that the person who did it was a part of their own family. The answers, while not providing the justice they had hoped for, at least brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty that had clouded their lives for over 3 decades.
There was somebody hiding by the woodpile that was piled in the driveway. And for some reason, they shot my dad.
He got out of his vehicle here and didn't even make it to his home and was shot in the walkway. Just the way the whole thing unfolded, it shocked this area.
While U.S. Navy officer Mervyn Sonny Groton was known to be a great dad amongst his family, his wife Norma shared different views. Even after 26 years of dedicated service to his homeland and marriage, Sonny fell short of winning some hearts and would end up paying the ultimate price. On December 16, 1983, in Belfast, Maine, 46-year-old Sonny Groton was on his way to work at the Naval Education Training Center in Newport, Rhode Island. As he walked out through the front door, making his way to the driveway, a loud noise of a firearm echoed through the air. Sonny Groton was shot on his front porch, while his wife and kids were just on the other side of the door. The alarming noise sent his wife Norma and son Michael rushing out to the yard where the sound had come from, and they were horrified to see Sonny lying on the floor with bullet wounds to his head and hand. Norma called 911 immediately for medical assistance, but he succumbed to his injuries and was pronounced dead later that night. The sudden death of Sonny was particularly perplexing, as there were no known enemies or suspicious activity surrounding him, which could result in such an ill fate. The case kept running in a loop, with no witnesses or suspects to move forward with, and it eventually went cold. Until 17 years later, a sting operation under the NCIS Department of the U.S. military would uncover the true horrors of Sonny's death. In early 2000s, detectives from the Maine State Police and Naval Criminal Investigative Service would join forces to reopen the case. The police had their eyes on a local man named Joe Fuller, who they had previously suspected but had no evidence against. The case found new direction when Joe's friend, Larry Phillips, came down to the station to report a bizarre incident. He spoke up about a conversation they shared while driving back from Maine's backcountry.
Joel asked me if I want a 30-30, and I said, sure. And he said, well, there's one up the brook.
It started as small talk about a 30-30 rifle when Joe asked Larry if he wanted one of those rifles for himself. With no reason to be suspicious, he agreed, and Joe took him to a brook where he said he had kept one of his. Joe showed him the way, which followed a small brook into the Maine woods. As they reached the destination, Larry turned off the car and started to get out, when Joe halted him by saying, "Don't bother, it's not in good condition anyway."
So I stopped the car and I started to get out. And he said, don't bother, it's not any good anyway, it's bent. The only thing it's good for is shooting around corners.
Joe described the rifle as bent and said that the only thing it could be used for was shooting around corners. This alerted detectives, as investigating officers had recovered a similarly described rifle from the woods back in 1985, 2 years after the initial homicide. The detectives now realized they had the murder weapon in hand. The barrel of the rifle was bent with a broken stock, and the damage was exactly how Joe had described it to be. Joe shared with Larry that he threw the gun there after being hired by a woman to kill her husband.
And then he started telling me about how he waited for him behind the woodpile. He waited for him to get home, and when the guy reached the house and reached for the door, he shot him in the back. And as he was laying on the ground, he was pleading with him. He shot him again through the hand and into the head.
Larry added that Joe was careful not to name anyone, but he mentioned the guy to be someone from the military. He had enacted the whole story on how he had been waiting behind the woodpile in front of the man's house and had patiently sat there waiting for him to reach the porch. And as the man went for his doorway, Joe shot him in the back. The shot had sent him to the ground, and as he pleaded with Joe, the cold-blooded man showed no remorse, and he shot him through his hand into his head. The information surrounding the case was highly confidential, so the officers were sure that unless Larry himself was the killer, the only possible scenario here was Joe Fuller carried out the crime. Larry Phillips provided a strong alibi, showing he was at work during the time of the murder, ruling him out as a suspect. Joe Fuller at the time had been convicted of a double homicide regarding 2 unrelated cases and was in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. He was serving a life sentence there and refused to engage in any interrogation regarding the case. Officers weren't going to give up after coming out so far. They formulated a plan to run a secret sting operation. Their plan was to use Joe's name to weed out the accomplices and to get them talking. The Maine DA obtained an indictment against Joe Fuller for the shooting of Sonny Groton. The team carefully released the news at a strategic time and approached Norma Groton in disguise. NCIS agent David Truesdale specialized in undercover fieldwork. He and other unnamed officers would carry out the plan of approaching Norma Groton.
Tony was a convict from the penitentiary where Joel was serving time. Joel's serving time in a federal penitentiary. So I assumed the role of a prison friend.
Huh? You Norma? Yeah. Hey, how you doing? Good. I'm Tony. What deal? My name's Tony. I'm a friend of Joe Fuller. He sent me out here to talk with you.
Norma and Tony climb into Norma's car, and Tony gets to the heart of the matter.
Listen, the police have come back talking to Joe, and he's scared. And he wanted me to come out here. I owe Joe some favors from the penitentiary. He did some things for me. And he's heard that somebody's cooperating in the case. And
sure ain't me, honey. No, sir. No.
Okay. Well, Joe really didn't think it was you.
No way.
Okay. Well,
but I don't know who it could be.
An undercover officer, who we will call Tony, pretended to be Joe's friend and went down to talk to the wife. Tony said he was a fellow convict who had been serving time at the same time as Joe in the federal penitentiary. He asked Norma about Joe Fuller. He introduced himself and firmly brought up the case of Sonny Groton. Tony said Joe wanted to know who ratted him out. and if Norma had any knowledge of it. She assured him right away that she had kept her end of the promise. Norma dropped her act as the bereaved, innocent widow in seconds. Her tone changed, and she seemed confident that she has kept her mouth shut all these years and expected the same from Joe. Norma pressured Tony to get word back to Joe that there had been no leak here and her involvement in the case should remain clean.
Yeah, but get word back to him. There's no leak here. No leak whatsoever. And I expect the same on that end. I don't know what.
Tony had struck a gold mine and wanted to dig even more. So he asked for names from Norma, asking if she had ever told anyone else about Joe. She came out with the name Boyd Smith. The investigating officers went through the files again and stumbled upon a guy named Boyd.
Who else did you tell? You would ask me real quick. Big, tall fella. Oh, shoot, what is his name? Boyd Smith.
Turned out Boyd Smith was a former boyfriend of one of the Groton girls, and for a year or so before the murder had lived at the Groton residence.
Boyd Smith was a former boyfriend to one of Groton's girls. The most crucial point was he lived at the Groton residence 1 year prior to the murder. Back in 1983, police had no reason or concern to involve his name in the case, but this brand new information led them to dig deeper. On April 6, 2001, in Camden, Maine, at the edge of the New England Cemetery, two undercover cops were waiting out in their truck and were joined by Tony and his supposed inmate friend named Bubba, who together were sent in to talk with Boyd Smith. The apparent prison pals waited till 12, when Boyd finally showed up. He hopped in their truck after some brief small talk. They wasted no time and got down to business, asking him straight away about his agreement with Norma, to which Boyd shared that Norma despised her husband. She apparently had wanted him gone for quite a long time. Norma had initially complained about Sonny and had asked Boyd if he could take care of him.
What was the actual agreement with you and Norma? How did that all come about?
Norma wanted her husband gone. I mean, that was the bottom line. He was always bitching and rah about it and this and that, and she asked me if I would do it. I said, no way, can't do it. And then she said, well, can you put me in contact with arrange something?
And then you put her in contact with Joe?
Mm-hmm. I didn't make any agreement with Joe. I put him in contact with her.
Boyd denied the offer, but agreed on helping her to get in touch with someone who can. The final confession of Boyd Smith was the last piece of the puzzle. All the dots were now connected with concrete pieces of evidence. Norma, Joe, and Boyd were all charged on separate counts for the murder of Sonny Groton. In the sturdy winter of February 2002, Central Maine was awaiting the murder trial of Groton. The cold case finally had its suspects, but the trial didn't go as well as expected. Juries acquitted both Joe Fuller and Boyd Smith of the murder charges. But in Joe's case, the trial got stuck due to Norma, who denied having any connection with him. The interrogation held between Norma and the agents ended up going nowhere, as she denied all possibilities, and the previously recorded tapes were ruled out as inadmissible in Joe's trial.
You're being fairly honest with us, but you're not telling us the Joel portion of this, and that bothers me.
That's why I can't help you with that, because I wasn't involved with him at any point.
Due to lack of permitted evidence, Joe was unfortunately not convicted for the murder charges. However, for Boyd Smith, the evidence clearly showed how he had conspired to murder Sonny. State law, nonetheless, barred prosecutors from pressing conspiracy charges, leaving jurors with the choice of murder or acquittal. Boyd didn't have any direct connection with the murder, apart from conspiring with Norma. Hence, he too was left with no charges recorded. But in Norma's trial, she had no such luck. A third jury charged her with murder of her husband and sentenced her to 70 years in prison at the Maine Correctional Center for Women. While Norma will rot in jail for her lifetime, Boyd walks away with no charges to his name. Fuller, on the other hand, was acquitted in the case, but was already serving a prison sentence for an unrelated murder. It does give the family of the victims a sense of assurance that the one stained with their father's blood will remain behind bars for a long time. On May 6, 1988, Jeff Reynolds would come back home after a day of work, only to be met with the cold, bludgeoned body of his wife lying in a pool of blood in the very bed they shared. A case with no leads, witnesses, or suspects was left unsolved for 13 long years, until 2001, when the case was taken up again. This time, justice came from an unexpected source, which finally helped put the case of Jana Reynolds to rest. What was the evidence that finally let the police arrest the assailant after 13 years? And why did it take so long for the case to be solved? On May 26, 1988, on the streets of Mount Vernon, 24-year-old Jeff Reynolds was living with his newlywed high school sweetheart, Jana Reynolds. Jeff had just gotten off work from his local printing store that day and was planning a fishing trip with a friend in the early spring morning. Before departing, first thing that caught his eye when he arrived was Jana's car sitting in the driveway when she should have already left for college by then.
Her car was in the carport. Thought nothing of it. And walked in. Noticed the back door had been broken into. And walked in and hollered for her. And I found her.
As soon as he reached the back door, his heart sank, as he saw the door frame was completely broken with the wooden door frame sticking out unevenly. Jeff, in a panic, yelled out for his wife Jana, getting more and more alarmed as he was left in dead silence. He rushed to their bedroom to discover the most horrific sight he could have ever possibly imagined. His beloved wife was laying in the bed, drowning in a pool of her own blood. The 22-year-old young woman had been beaten up and showed signs of aggravated assault along with multiple stab wounds. Jana was beyond recognition. Her throat had been severely cut and right hand nearly amputated with a lacerated wrist. Jana was a licensed practical nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital with an ongoing college associate degree in nursing from Wren Lake College. The ambitious young woman had been set to graduate just a week before the tragedy struck. Faced with the cold, lifeless body of his wife, Jeff's screams echoed throughout the neighborhood. A 911 call was made, and investigators rushed to the scene. Jana's deceased body was found laying over the bed. She had her pajama bottoms and underwear pulled down to her ankles. Her top had been pulled up, exposing her body, which was in a horribly mutilated condition. There were multiple stab wounds all over her throat, and her throat had been slashed deeply. Her wrist had been badly lacerated to the point that it was barely attached to the arm. Though Jeff came up as the primary suspect initially, his strong alibi eliminated him soon after. He was at work the entire night of May 5, 1988, and medical reports confirmed that the time of assault was somewhere between 12 and 3 a.m., leaving no reason for suspicion. Police interviewed a number of suspects who had been seen in the area around that time, and one of those suspects was Albert McDaniel. Albert was found lingering around the house on that fateful night. When the police brought him in for questioning, he complied. He volunteered to give samples of his blood, hair, and saliva to aid with the ongoing investigation, and all the tests came back negative. The open case had over 300 leads and no conclusive suspects at hand. The case soon grew cold, with no circumstantial evidence and low medical advancements to move further on. 13 years later, in August of 2001, the Mount Vernon Police Department decided to take another look at the now 13-year-old case of Jana Reynolds.
In the back of my mind, I was hopeful that I could find something that either was missed or was not available at the time back in 1988. From the knee area of the left leg of the thermal bottom's got a stain here, a bigger stain in here, and one here. Up around the crotch area, got a stain here, here. And moving down to the right leg area, down past the knee, got a stain here, 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 and here.
Their primary thought was that new advancements in technology might help them find something they had missed out on before. All the collected evidence was re-evaluated, and miraculously, the bottoms worn by Jana turned up with some bodily fluid stains on them. Both her underwear and pajama bottoms confirmed the fluid's pre-existence, and the extracted DNA was just enough to build up a profile for the killer. Investigators went back to all the recorded suspects in the case, but left with no match. While the police were looking through old files for cases with the same circumstances, They stumbled upon an eerily similar case from the 1990s, the murder of Dina Dahl, who had then lived in the same neighborhood of Mount Vernon. She had faced a tragic incident just 3 years after Jana's demise. On October 22, 1991, Dina was busy with her nightly routine as she turned up Bon Jovi over the speakers and laid out on the couch waiting to fall asleep. Her sweet dreams were halted minutes later as she heard someone pushing down her door.
Laying on my couch, listening to Bon Jovi, trying to go to sleep, and I heard a forceful push on my door, and looked up from the couch, and he was standing there.
The moment she opened her eyes, the sinister gaze of her assaulter sent shivers down her spine. The next thing she knew was being held against the couch at the stake of her own life, while her attacker proceeded to attempt to physically assault her. The house was empty, and Dina's husband was out. She knew if she resisted, her life would be taken away in the span of seconds.
Pushed me back down on the couch and proceeded to attempt to rape me. After a while, he finally left, and he told me if I told anyone or if I went to the police, he would kill me.
The assaulter fled the scene afterwards, but not before threatening Dina that if she went on to the police, he would come after her. A report was filed, but no arrests were made in the case. Dina said that she would often feel someone looking at her through the windows, and a couple of months later, as she took notice of the same pair of sinister eyes gazing at her, she called out for her husband in fright. Dina made a call to the police, and subsequently patrol cars were appointed to the scene, as the squad combed throughout the locality. At the Westcott, an African-American male was found walking down the street. When police approached him for questioning, they immediately recognized that face, and it was Joe Tucker.
As I was driving east on Westcott, I saw a black male walking a pretty good clip, walking down the street at a pretty good pace, and I stopped the car and got out, approached him, and as I did, I recognized him as Joe Tucker.
Since 1988, Joe had found himself in quite a bit of trouble in Illinois and was now working in Missouri. He had multiple charges of drug abuse, theft, burglary, and other petty charges to his name. Officers around the lot knew him well, and finding him there that night was an uncanny coincidence. Joe said he was out for a walk while sweating profusely in the cold air.
I asked him what he was doing, and he just told me that he was out for a walk at that time of night. It was a cool evening, and really he should not have been sweating like he was for just out for a walk.
It was late October and was a fairly cold winter evening, and he should not have been sweating that much if he was just indeed out for a walk. At that given moment, they had no evidence against him, so he was left alone, even though his activity was considered suspicious. Months later, the attacker struck again, when Dina Dahl was returning to her trailer after visiting a neighbor. She felt like someone was following her and ran for her life.
I said, who is it? And he said, it's me. And I knew it was him, and I hit the back door. He chased me around, all the way around, down to the road and up into the neighbor's backyard before he caught me. And then he pushed me to the ground and attempted to hurt me. And the whole time I was just fighting him. I was fighting for my life.
The man chased her down to the neighbor's backyard, where he pinned Dina down to the ground and attempted to assault her. She consistently fought against him, and the suspect fled on foot, leaving Dina stranded in the field. The investigating officers were informed right away. However, the case went nowhere. A decade later, the Mount Vernon police delved into the case of Jana Reynolds once again and combed through every report from the area which took place during the years that had followed. In 2001, Detective McElroy went over Dina's case and noticed it shared similarities with the attack on Jana that happened on May 6, 1988. An intuition made him run forensics on both the cases. Joe Tucker, who was a person of interest in Dina Dahl's case, was tested against the DNA of the unknown profile secured from Jana's clothing.
Basically, I got a call from the scientist that was working on this. And I remember where I was at. We had a bomb threat called into our high school, and we knew what phone payphone had been called from. And I was dusting the payphone for Prince when I got a call on my cell phone. And basically, Kristen told me that we got a match.
Joe Tucker ended up matching the profile, and further digging revealed how he had come to know Jana Reynolds. McElroy found that both Joe and Jana had worked together during their high school years at a popular fast food joint in town.
Jana Reynolds and Joe had worked together a few years prior to that at a local fast food establishment here in town. And Jana only worked there a couple of months. It was the only job she had through high school. She was 16 when she worked there. Joe Tucker was a cook, and Jana Reynolds waited on, took orders. And so their paths had crossed.
The ample motive was enough to issue an arrest warrant, but Joe Tucker did not cave in against the wealth of evidence. The detective tried every trick in the book to get him to confess, but he was adamant on denying every claim thrown at him. Joe waived extradition, but was sent to Menard's prison on a parole violation. While awaiting his trial, Joe found himself talking to an inmate at Menard. The inmate, who also had a long history of criminal behavior, suggested that Joe Tucker document everything that happened and his involvement in the case. Joe did just that.
He sought out a person in Menard who had a reputation for having legal knowledge, and he asked this person to help him prepare a defense for this case, Jana Reynolds' case. He told Joe, well, write down everything you did in this case. So Joe writes down basically how he kills Jana Reynolds. It's on one page.
But the inmate suggested that the one-page document was not sufficient and told him to provide more details.
Joe goes back and writes several more pages, 5 or 6 more pages, even draws a diagram of the house, of Jana Reynolds' house.
Joe mentioned Jana Reynolds in his letter and even drew a diagram of her house. The inmate then quickly turned the letter over to prosecutors.
He showed them to me, and I was a little skeptical at first, but as I read the letters, it seemed that, knowing the evidence and knowing the case like I knew it, I knew that the person that wrote these letters probably was the killer.
Despite arguments from the defense, the inmate was allowed to testify, and the confession was admitted into evidence. The inmate testified that he was not offered anything in exchange for his testimony and was not working as an agent of the police when he obtained the confession letter. On April 11, 2006, the jury declared Joe Tucker guilty of murdering Jana Reynolds and was sentenced to life imprisonment with no chance of parole.
Identified human remains found in Cumberland County 40 years ago.
Officials say a man was stabbed multiple times. His skeletal remains were found near Sycamore Lane in Crossville.
In the eerie echoes of a 1983 Tennessee forest, a team of investigators would stumble upon a bizarre case revolving around an unnamed victim who would remain unidentified for 40 years. A teenager's body would be excavated from the wooded abandoned ground of Sycamore Lane in Crossville. The town was not the safest with its raging drug abuse and assault cases, but a homicide from 1983 surely shook things up in the area. Forensic teams found multiple stab wounds all over the child's body, which led them ruling it as a homicide. As they were unable to identify him, he was named the Cumberland County John Doe. On August 26, 1983, the unidentified body of a then 17-year-old teenager would turn up at the station of Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, or the TBI. The investigating officers would do all they could to solve the case, starting from the victim's identity. The TBI would send in their special organization, an Unidentified Human Remains DNA Initiative, along with the help of Cumberland County Sheriff, who would join forces to identify the long-lost victim. While the search was underway, investigating officers stumbled upon a potential suspect named Michael Lee Carmack. In May 1988, Michael would be charged with the homicide of this John Doe, but the exact motive to this crime still remains unknown to many. The same year, he would plead guilty to those charges in Cumberland County Court and get sentenced to 20 years in imprisonment for the second-degree murder offense. While he did not elaborate on the motive behind the killing, it is assumed that it was a random killing, as he even did not reveal the identity of the victim. While the perpetrator may have been served justice, investigators still unaware of the identity of the Cumberland County's John Doe. They would continue with failed attempts for the next 24 years till September 2007. In this year, the University of Tennessee Forensic Anthropology Center submitted a sample of his remains to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, which finally came back with a reconstructed DNA profile. Almost immediately, the profile was run through the Combined DNA Index System and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System in great hopes of a possible identification. But all led to no avail, as no matches were found, even after countless exercises. In December 2022, as a part of the Unidentified Human Remains DNA Initiative, TBI agents submitted a sample of the man's skeletal remains to Othram in Texas for forensic genetic genealogical testing. Scientists at Othram were accommodated with much better forensic-grade equipment and were able to develop a suitable DNA extract from the available remains. The team ran the profile and came up with leads that were returned to the Tennessee Bureau. The case picked up right where it left, and along with the TBI agents, an intelligence analysis was hired who used the investigative leads from Othram to locate potential family members in Michigan. The John Doe of Cumberland was finally identified as Kenneth Levall Thompson of Detroit, Michigan. Born on April 11th of 1965, Kenneth was merely 17 when his family lost track of him in the lands of Tennessee. Agents made contact with the extended family members, who said they had a brother, but had not heard from in the last 4 decades. After the initial process of standard tests and DNA reference samples confirmed his identity, officers still had questions. Although the body was successfully identified as Kenneth Thompson, other information surrounding the case still remains a mystery. Questions like who Kenneth Thompson was and why was he murdered still remain unanswered. The case has remained open, with hopes of providing these answers to his family someday. Litchfield, a serene town in the state of New York. It was in this town that a shocking crime occurred in 1993, with the disappearance of 12-year-old Sara Ann Wood. Sara was born on March 4, 1981, to Robert Wood and Frances Wood. She had 2 older siblings, Dusty and Nikki. Sara was an intelligent and lively child with a love of dancing and poetry. She was quite religious, being raised in such a household. Moreover, her contagious laughter made her very lovable to her family and friends. But little did anyone know that her story would take a harrowing turn, leaving an unfading mark on the town's history. On August 18, 1993, Sara, at the tender age of 12, vanished without a trace. The haunting event unfolded as she rode her bike near Norwich Corners Church, where her father Robert served as a pastor. She was wearing a pink t-shirt with the words "Guess Who" embroidered upon the front, turquoise blue shorts, and brown sandals. The place where she was last seen was less than half a mile from her home. Within an hour of Sara's disappearance, her parents, brother, and sister became alarmed by her absence. The child was reported missing to the police later that same afternoon, prompting an immediate and intensive response. Several hundred troopers and volunteer firefighters launched a search covering several dozens of square miles of terrain. Sara's family took matters into their own hands, conducting searches around their neighborhood and printing and distributing missing person flyers. Sara's bicycle was soon discovered leaning against a tree several yards from Hackadam Road.
We found her bicycle thrown in a bunch of brush off the side of Hackadam Road, and all her church papers. She had been attending summer program, Bible school, at her father's church, which was probably about 1.5 miles away from her residence.
A search of the area revealed her coloring book and crayons, hidden in a nearby brush, leading investigators to rapidly conclude that she had been transported from the site of her abduction in a vehicle. Over the next 5 days, an extensive ground-level search was conducted by both state police and forest rangers in the vicinity of Sara's disappearance and other potential areas of interest. Despite extensive efforts, the search yielded no clues to her whereabouts, and the extensive news coverage of her disappearance galvanized much of the public throughout upstate New York. More than 1,000 leads were received and pursued or discounted, with a public reward for Sara's safe return reaching over $150,000. Police searches were supported by the active involvement of hundreds of members of the community, who assisted in their search and provided refreshments for volunteers and investigators alike. Teal ribbons symbolizing Sara were placed in numerous public locations as a poignant reminder of the ongoing search. As the days passed, the nationwide outreach intensified. The efforts to recover Sara alive or deceased expanded statewide and then nationwide. An improvised headquarters named the Rescue Sara Center was established in Hartford, New York, to coordinate and manage information. Thousands of missing persons posters were circulated across America, and appeals and updates regarding Sara's abduction were broadcast on national television programs, such as 48 Hours and America's Most Wanted. The collective hope and determination to find Sara reached communities far beyond her immediate surroundings, creating a widespread network of support in the quest for her safe return.
We're looking at this anew. We're going to devote some attention to it, and we're going to try our best to locate her.
Despite the exhaustive initial searches and nationwide efforts, the case went cold for the next 3 years, with no leads in Sara's disappearance. Meanwhile, parenting at Herkimer County underwent a profound transformation, with heightened vigilance and protective measures becoming a way of life. The impact of Sara's abduction reverberated beyond the legal sphere, leaving an enduring imprint on the collective consciousness of the community. As investigators relentlessly followed leads, new information continued to emerge, demonstrating the enduring impact of Sara's case on the collective consciousness. In 1995, the town witnessed the initiation of an annual event that would come to symbolize both remembrance and raising awareness, the Ride for Missing Children. This initiative, inspired by Sara's case, began as a small group of cyclists, including Sara's father and brother, covering approximately 400 miles from Utica, New York to Washington, D.C. Their mission was to raise awareness about Sara's disappearance and contribute to the broader cause of missing and exploited children. In the years that followed, each annual ride became much bigger. Sara's case remained unsolved until a startling disclosure in 1996. In 1996, a breakthrough occurred in Sara's case when 45-year-old Louis Stephen Lent Jr., a former handyman and janitor from North Adams, Massachusetts, was formally charged with her abduction and murder. The connection leading to Lent's arrest was established through a chilling incident that took place on January 7, 1994. Lent had attempted to abduct a 12-year-old girl named Rebecca Savarese at gunpoint in Pittsfield. Fortunately, Savarese managed to thwart the abduction by feigning a severe asthma attack, allowing her to escape from Lent's grasp. The attempted abduction did not go unnoticed, as an eyewitness observed the incident and discreetly followed Lent's vehicle. This vigilant observer noted Lent's license plate number, which was promptly relayed to the police. A subsequent search of Lent's pickup truck revealed alarming items such as duct tape, a knife, a gun, a pair of child sunglasses, and candy. Furthermore, a search of Lent's van uncovered Savarese's backpack and a loaded revolver. These compelling pieces of evidence linked Lent to the attempted abduction and led to his arrest. After Lent's arrest, there was a discovery of a private chamber under Lent's Lanesboro home, designed for the explicit purpose of restraining and abusing future victims. Investigators were led down a chilling path that unraveled the depths of Lent's sinister intentions. The incomplete chamber, which he confessed was intended for restraining and abusing primarily female victims, provided a harrowing insight into Lent's twisted plans. Shortly after Lent's arrest for the attempted abduction of Rebecca Savarese, investigators in New York found that Lent's victim profile and circumstances closely aligned with Sara's abduction, prompting a closer scrutiny of Lent's possible involvement. Subsequent interrogation of Lent revealed a horrifying confession. Not only did Lent admit to the assault and murder of Sara Wood, but he also confessed to the abduction and murder of James Joseph Bernardo, a 12-year-old boy from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, on October 22, 1990. Lent's account of the abduction of James Bernardo involved a sinister encounter outside the movie theater where Lent worked as a janitor. Offering the boy $5 to move chairs, Lent bound Bernardo at knife point and transported him to his home. The following morning, Lent drove the blindfolded boy to a wooded area in Newfield, New York, where he strangled him to death with a section of rope. The duct tape found on Bernardo's mouth and eyes matched the items discovered in Lent's vehicle during his arrest, substantiating the details of Lent's confession. Regarding Sara Wood, Lent chillingly described encountering her on Hackadam Road, where he forcibly dragged her into his van at knife point. He admitted to assaulting Sara before ruthlessly bludgeoning her with a tree branch as she begged for her life. Lent claimed to have buried Sara's body in a shallow grave within a clearing near Racket Lake, in or near the town of Inlet, in the Adirondack Mountains. Lent agreed to draw a map detailing the location of her burial, providing investigators with a crucial lead in the pursuit of justice for Sara Wood. Now, Lent's admission sent shockwaves through the community, bringing forth the claim that he had buried her in the Adirondack Mountains. Despite exhaustive searches, Sara's remains remained missing.
I've spoken to investigators that were involved with the initial crime back in 1993. And yeah, I think he probably does withhold the key piece of information. That is exactly where her body is located.
The legal proceedings unfolded in April 1997, when Lent Jr. was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison by Hermiker County Judge Patrick Kirk for the kidnapping and murder of Sara Wood. The impact of Lent Jr.'s heinous crimes prompted Judge Kirk to remark that the case answered the affirmative to the question of the death penalty. This was a sentiment reflective of the gravity of Sara's tragic fate. However, due to a prior conviction in Massachusetts, Lent Jr. was already serving a life sentence without parole for the 1990 murder of 12-year-old Jimmy Bernardo. This development meant that Lent Jr. would never serve his New York sentence. In 2023, 3 decades after her death, Herkimer County District Attorney Jeffrey Carpenter and New York State Police Senior Investigator Dennis Daughtry remain steadfast in their commitment in finding Sara's remains.
It's been 20 years. We still get some occasional tips that come in. We investigate all of them that have the least bit of credibility.
Carpenter and New York State Police Senior Investigator Dennis Daughtry, head of the Major Crimes Unit, were just starting out in their careers when Wood was abducted in 1993. But her disappearance still had a powerful impact on them nonetheless.
All you've got to do is look at a picture of Sara Ann Wood, look at the smile on her face to know that that's the type of case that stays with you your whole career and beyond.
Collaboration between active and retired investigators fueled a better effort. In the summer of 2023, a retired investigator suggested a new ground search based on reflections about conversations with Lent Jr. This proactive approach underscored the determination to leave no stone unturned in the search. Carpenter, reflecting on the case, acknowledged that the criminal aspect of the investigation had concluded, but the promise made 3 decades ago to relentlessly pursue leads remained unbroken. New leads continued to pour in. Carpenter noted that the New York State Police Major Crimes Unit had been actively involved in the case since its inception. The dedication of the investigative team was further exemplified by a ground search conducted for Sara's remains between June and August of 2023. The state police maintained communication with the convicted killer, Louis Lent Jr., visiting him several times a year to keep the lines of communication open. Now, in 2024, over 30 years after Sara's abduction, the search for her remains continues to be an active pursuit. Herkimer County District Attorney Jeffrey Carpenter, in an interview with the Daily Sentinel, emphasized the enduring commitment to pursue every lead. While her family likely never fully healed from losing their beloved Sara, they have done their utmost to help others who have faced the same terrible situations of a child gone missing. Following Sara's disappearance, they founded the Sara Ann Wood Rescue Center. This center later became the Mohawk Valley branch of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and remains operational. In 2017 alone, the efforts of this branch resulted in the safe recovery of 399 children nationwide. Over the years, the Ride for Missing Children, started the year after Sara went missing, has evolved into one of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's major annual fundraisers. Sara became the symbolic figure honored through their jersey that the cyclists wear, as it's made up of her favorite colors, teal and pink. While the initial event had only 43 cyclists, now their annual events have thousands of attendees. The community's commitment to this cause exemplifies the resilience born out of tragedy, turning Sara's story into a catalyst for positive action. This next case takes us to Garden Grove, California. On May 21, 1987, a shadow fell over the city as the life of 23-year-old Shannon Rose Lloyd was ruthlessly taken in her own apartment. Found violated and strangled, the case perplexed investigators for years. The investigative journey began in 1987 when the discovery of Shannon Lloyd's lifeless body in her Garden Grove apartment. The young woman, remembered for her love of horses and adventurous spirit, met a tragic end that left her family grappling with unimaginable grief. An autopsy revealed that she had been assaulted and the killer had strangled her to death. While there was evidence found at the crime scene, at the time, DNA testing was not advanced enough to be able to use this evidence to identify any suspects. And, with a lack of leads to follow, the case went cold. 2 years later, on February 19, 1989, another body was found. 27-year-old Renee Cuevas was found dead near the Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in Irvine, California. The manner of death was the same as Shannon. At this crime scene, too, physical evidence was found and stored in the hopes of it being useful in the future. However, here too, the case eventually went cold. It wasn't until 2003 that a breakthrough occurred. In 2003, both crimes were connected through DNA evidence. The DNA profiles found at both the crime scenes of Shannon and Renee were a positive match. However, despite both murders being connected, there were no other breakthroughs at the time, and the police were unable to match the profile they now had to anyone in their database. Again, both cases went cold. In 2021, the Orange County District Attorney's investigative team turned to a revolutionary tool, genetic genealogy. This technique, relying on partial DNA matches to construct family trees, pinpointed a possible suspect.
This team of scientists and investigators were able to identify a possible suspect, Reuben J. Smith.
Smith, a resident of Orange County during the 1980s, had a disturbing criminal record. Smith lived in Orange County in the 1980s, and in 1998 was accused of attacking a woman in Las Vegas and trying to kill her. His DNA sample from 1998 held the key to solving these cold case murders. The survivor of Smith's 1998 attack, who did not want her identity disclosed and haunted by the ordeal, provided a chilling first-hand account of the evil that lurked within him. It was horrible, the things that he did, the things that he said. He told me he was going to kill me, she said, still haunted by the pain he inflicted on her. The DNA evidence from his arrest matched the evidence found at the crime scene of both Lloyd and Cuevas, confirming his role in their murders. The news brought a sense of closure, yet it left lingering questions for the families, as the why behind the cruel acts remained unanswered. The families, who had endured more than 3 decades of uncertainty, finally had some of the answers they sought. But tragically, they couldn't see Smith facing justice, as he ended his own life in 1999. At the age of 39, way before the case was solved. The DNA evidence not only confirmed Smith as the culprit, but also underscored the power of scientific advancements in cracking cold cases. The Orange County District Attorney, Todd Spitzer, emphasized that with this advent of such technology, no case remains truly cold. Now, once the case was closed in 2021, Tom Lloyd, Shannon's older brother, reflected on his sister's toughness and the profound loss their family endured. The surviving victim from Smith's 1998 attack also shared the horror she faced, expressing the lasting impact on her life. The families of both victims, while gaining closure about the who and where, still struggled with unanswered questions of why their loved ones met such tragic ends. Meanwhile, the media coverage played a crucial role in disseminating the developments of this case. Reports highlighted the significance of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases, citing around 200 instances nationwide where this technique had been successful.
We have resolved 4 homicides in Orange County since the advent of genetic genealogy, and nationwide law enforcement has closed 200 cases across this country as a result of genetic genealogy.
Orange County law enforcement officials, including Garden Grove Police Chief Amir Alfara, acknowledged the dedication of the investigative teams involved in solving these cold cases. The resolution of the Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas cold cases served as a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice. The Orange County law enforcement's dedication to seeking answers, even decades after the crime occurred, resonated through the statements of District Attorney Todd Spitzer and Sheriff Coroner Don Barnes.
In closing, I would like to thank the Orange County Sheriff's Department, the Orange County District Attorney's Office for our partnerships and willingness to solve these cases. We hope that these cases being solved somehow bring some closure to their families.
On February 15, 2003, a 911 operator received a call from a concerned resident at 2572 Sarvis Court, Cincinnati, Ohio, complaining about a strong odor coming from his neighbor's apartment. The neighbor, Herman Brown, had not been seen in a while. So, officers from the Cincinnati Police Department decided to pay a welfare check on Herman. Upon knocking and getting no response, the officers entered the house, stepping into a most gruesome scene. Herman Brown lay naked on the floor, a wire cord wrapped around his neck. He was deceased. It would take 2 decades, but police would eventually unmask the evil perpetrator of this murder through DNA testing. Who wrapped the wire cord around Herman's neck? How did the person escape for 2 decades? On February 15, 2003, a 911 operator received a call from 2572 Sarvis Court. The caller was a concerned resident calling to report that his neighbor, Herman Brown, had not been seen in a long time, and a strong odor was coming from his apartment. 2 police officers were dispatched to the residence to pay a welfare check on Herman. When they got to the apartment, they knocked and called Herman several times, but got no response. After a few minutes of knocking and calling out without getting a response, the officers entered the apartment to check if Herman was there. When they forced the door open, the first thing that hit them was the acrid stench of death. Herman lay on the floor of his bedroom with the wire cord wrapped around his neck. Right away, the officers could tell that he was deceased. Even as they called for backup, the officers suspected the cause of death was strangulation. When backup arrived, they bagged Herman's body and sent it for medical examination. Meanwhile, officers at the scene searched the entire apartment for clues as to who could have taken Herman's life so coldly. There was no sign of forced entry, meaning the perpetrator was likely someone Herman knew or was familiar enough with to welcome them into his home. During their search, investigators found some cigarette butts that, upon further investigation, did not belong to Herman. When investigators sent all the evidence to the state crime lab for testing, it turned out that those cigarette butts had DNA that did not match Herman's. This meant the killer was probably the owner of the cigarette butts. They likely had a smoke while chatting with Herman shortly before taking his life. Investigators just had to find the match for the DNA, and they would solve the case. However, despite the promising start, finding a match for the DNA proved to be an almost impossible task. Although DNA testing relatively well developed in 2003, it wasn't enough to identify the owner of the DNA on the cigarette butts that could potentially be the killer. Investigators tried every trick in the book, interviewing friends and family members, accepting hundreds of DNA swabs from volunteers, and going through every clue and piece of evidence at the crime scene. It was never enough. The killer eluded them. They had escaped justice, at least for a few decades. The Herman Brown case went cold and was shelved for 17 years. Almost 20 years after Herman Brown was strangled with a wire cord in his own home, police finally had the one thing they could use to identify his killer. The one thing they didn't have all those years ago. Newer, more advanced technology that could potentially find out who the DNA on the cigarette butts belonged to. In 2020, investigators took a sample of DNA from the cigarette butts found at the crime scene that didn't belong to Herman and ran it through the public genealogy databases. Their aim: identify any possible relatives to the owner of the DNA sample that is already on the database. When the search results came out, investigators Heather Sadler and Chad Kepi from the Cincinnati Real-Time Crime Unit knew they had a lot of work on their hands. The search had turned up hundreds of names that could be relatives of the DNA sample's owner, creating a puzzle that the investigators now had to roll up their sleeves and piece together. The first step was to narrow down the list of relatives, keeping in mind that the killer was just within their grasp if they could find the right link. The Cincinnati Police Department had used the same technology to solve 2 other assault and homicide cases, so they were confident that with a little more patience and effort, they would find the killer. Finally, after weeks of grueling investigative work, a match was found. The DNA sample collected at the crime scene 20 years ago belonged to 64-year-old Robert Stewart. In the 3 years after police identified a match with the DNA sample they obtained from the crime scene, police had to ensure they had the right guy. So, they conducted further testing, refined the results, and double-checked every shred of evidence. They also painstakingly built their case against Robert Stewart to avoid him eventually escaping justice on some technicality. Finally, on September 25, 2023, Robert was arrested in Lima, Ohio, and extradited to Hamilton County.
Do want to show you a video just into the newsroom of Stewart being booked into the Hamilton County Justice Center. He's there in the red sweatshirt. The prosecutor's office says police collected DNA evidence from the victim, the apartment, and cigarette butts that were left behind at the time at the scene. And the DNA was unknown at the time. But thanks to current technology, that DNA was matched to Stewart, and further testing confirmed that match.
While awaiting indictment and trial, he was held in Hamilton County Justice Center on a $500,000 bond. On October 2, 2023, Hamilton County Prosecutor Melissa Powers announced the indictment of Robert for the 2003 murder of Herman Brown. Robert was indicted on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of felonious assault, and if he gets convicted on all the charges, he could be facing life imprisonment. In the announcement, Powers said, "The Cincinnati Police Homicide Unit should be commended. These dedicated detectives never give up on their cases. They never give up on their victims. They will continue to investigate until the case is solved, no matter how long it takes." The genealogy databases have proved to be a powerful tool for law enforcement to solve cases that have been cold for years. I am thankful we are finally able to bring closure to Herman Brown's family and friends. Upon successfully solving the Herman Brown cold case, the Cincinnati Police Department pledged to continue solving cold cases using DNA technology and all other resources at their disposal. This includes a grant from a group called Season of Justice. Although they failed to go into detail, the Cincinnati police announced that their next task was solving a cold case from 1989. Herman Brown's killer was unable to escape apprehension thanks to the persistence of investigators at the Cincinnati Police Department and new technology leading to the identification and arrest of his killer. As the world and Herman's loved ones await justice, Herman can rest in peace knowing that his killer was at least caught. Will Robert Stewart get the maximum punishment for murder, or will his defense team successfully make a case against that? On August 11, 2002, in Louisville, Kentucky, Detective Duncan received a call from the Churchill Park Apartments reporting a chilling case of assault. The woman was terrorized in every manner possible, while her 8-year-old son, who was left unharmed, slept sound right in the next room beside hers. As soon as the detective reached the site, he was met by the victim's frightened boyfriend, who handed him his phone, saying, "He's on call, the one who did it."
The boyfriend of the victim walks up to me and hands me his cell phone and said, "He's on the line." And then, of course, I asked who's on the line, and he said, "The guy that did it."
Duncan picked up the call, only to be met by the most horrifying experience in his entire career. Crafty Drive's notorious rapist was out on the loose for over 14 years, leaving no traces to his identity whatsoever. But he would make one mistake that would finally reveal Louisville's most tragic horrors and bring his reign of terror to an end. What did the assailant tell the detective? Who was he, and what was it that finally brought him down? Let us dive right in to find the answers. The case starts with the first known victim, Shannon Johnson. On February 28, 1998, 29-year-old Shannon was living alone with her daughter in the streets of 5101 Crafty Drive. In the middle of the night, she woke up to a horrifying scene as she felt someone's pressure on top of her.
He tried to get between my legs, and I'm thinking, okay, if I let him go through with this and he kills me, what's he going to do to my daughter?
The man had Shannon on his knife point while he tried to get between her legs, taking control over her body. Within seconds, Shannon's thoughts ran to her child.
And I grabbed it with this hand by the blade, and then we started fighting. We struggled for a minute, maybe even less than a minute. He stops.
He rushed towards the door while pulling up his pants and took off running. Almost immediately after checking up on her daughter, Shannon dialed 911. Soon the local police were dispatched to the scene, and the case was all too familiar. Not even 12 days before, on the night of February 16th, a woman was attacked in the very same apartment complex. During interrogation, Shannon stated she could tell that the guy was an African American by the texture of his hair. It was close cut and short, and his height was slightly taller than hers. The description Shannon shared matched perfectly with the information that was given during the earlier assault cases. Investigators, however, were clueless, as there was no incidental evidence. All the crime scenes were found clean, with no prints or DNA. The circumstances left the police with no choice but to move on without a suspect. In the same neighborhood of Crafty Drive, 56-year-old Terry Poe would wake up a little past 3 a.m. feeling a heavy weight on top of her. The senior woman would be shocked to see that a man was trying to take advantage of her. Terry said she didn't remember if she was kneed or hit on the stomach, but the man overpowered her somehow and said to her face that he's going to assault her.
I don't know if he kneed me or he hit me in the stomach, but he just doubled me up and he said, I'm going to you.
He pushed her up against the couch, pressing the sharp blade of his knife on her throat. Terry added that in the beginning, he would just cut her enough to let her know she would be killed if she resists.
On the beginning, he was just cut it enough to let you know he would cut you. Just enough that you could feel the blood trickling, you know.
He ripped the buttons first, and then her entire pajamas. Next, he got himself on top, threatening Terry to do as he says. The apartment was empty, and she knew she had to accept her fate. Terry did her best to comply with the enraged perpetrator while she was pinned to the couch. Throughout the night, Terry had to face the length of horrors as the man assaulted her repeatedly. After he was done, he slipped out the back door and disappeared into the dark. Detective Larry Carroll from the Louisville Metro Police Department was asked to respond to the scene as an evidence technician detective. The crime took place on the streets of 5102, only blocks away from Shannon's apartment. Larry recognized the pattern of the crime and knew it had to be the notorious aggressor.
The suspect description also was the same in all of these crimes. And the Jefferson County Police certainly felt that they had a serial in this area that was operating.
The police department had named him the Crafty Drive. However, as quickly as these cases advanced, they abruptly stopped. Detective Larry was confused about what happened to the perpetrator. They didn't know who he was or whether he was going to turn up anytime soon. Was he incarcerated somewhere else? Did he move out of state? And what actually happened to cease these attacks all of a sudden? 7 months would pass by in the quiet, with no new information coming up. In the fall of 1998, around September, Detective Dwayne Colbank, who was in charge of robbery cases in the Louisville Metro Police Department, would get called up to investigate 2 BP gas station assaults. The incident had similar patterns to the Crafty Drive Rapist. The collected DNA samples would confirm the attacks were done by a single man, who would be later dubbed by the investigators as the BP Oil. Colbank was immediately certain that there was a connection between the BP Oil case and Crafty Drive. The investigation team were confident in their statement and knew they were all looking for the same individual. BP Oil Station lies in close proximity to Crafty Drive, having only 4 miles in between.
We were pretty confident that it was the same individual. Close proximity, I mean, 4 miles. You really don't have that many serial strangers.
Another unusual fact was the pattern to all these cases. Serial stranger assaults were highly unfamiliar to the neighborhood of Louisville. On August 11, 2002, after spending 4 years in silence, the treacherous assailant finally struck again. Detective Larry Duncan was rushed to arrive at the Churchill Park Apartments. It was reported that a woman in her mid-30s was physically assaulted and terrorized by a predator who had been on the loose. The incident took place the previous night in her own apartment while she was sound asleep, next to the room of her 8-year-old son. Though the child was left unharmed, the woman went through the depth of horrors. The names of the respective family members and victims are kept hidden to protect their identity. Duncan immediately had a hunch while he was on his way, but what he was met with next would be one of the most intense situations he had ever faced in his entire life. As soon as he stepped in, he was met by the victim's frantic boyfriend.
The boyfriend of the victim walks up to me and hands me his cell phone and said, "He's on the line." And then, of course, I asked who's on the line, and he said, "The guy that did it."
Duncan was shocked as he heard the man describe himself carefully, disguising his identity not to spill any personal details. Throughout the entirety of the next 15 minutes, Detective Duncan would hear the sadistic predator describe the severity of his crime in graphic details. Duncan was beyond just shocked. It was disturbing how a man could just confess to such heinous acts with a brag. He'd stop him to ask, why would he do something like this?
And he said, "It's just something that I do."
The man on the line would let out a little scoff and said, "Just because he can. It's just something that he does." The sheer confidence and normalcy of his tone was enough to shake up the detective. The call would be abruptly cut short soon after. This case was unlike anything he knew before, and the entire team was on the lookout for evidence and forensics. The team would investigate the point of entry, the broken-up living room screen alongside the window frame, and the exact first location Duncan searched at. He was able to acquire the most beautiful prints he could have possibly found. He immediately went back to the station, waiting for the reports to come back.
That I dusted 2 of the most beautiful prints that you've ever seen came up. I knew that this was my man's print. This was the serial rapist's fingerprint.
He immediately went back to the station, waiting for the reports to come back. The investigation finally had their first piece of evidence, and Duncan was sure he was reaching close to the perpetrator. The fingerprint was run through AFIS, Automated Fingerprint Identification System, without a match. However, the investigation would soon take a huge turn. Along with the cell phone, the perpetrator also stole the victim's ATM card. The card was run through the system, and the entire team was on a mission to figure out where the card gets used next. The card was used over 24 times around the streets of Bardstown.
Bardstown Road here in our city, and we captured a variety of images of him using the card.
And not one, but multiple CCTV footages were captured around the city to identify the perpetrator, from department stores to parking lots. All eyes around the city were on him. He was found using the card for a transaction in a parking space, and through the surveillance camera, a wide view of his face was finally recorded.
Personally, I was 100% confident that someone would identify him because the images was too good, the shirt was too unique for somebody not to recognize.
Within the next few hours, the entire investigation team was on a manhunt. All the acquired images were plastered on every screen, from newspaper to TV. Every news broadcast was on alert across Louisville. Duncan was positive that someone would surely identify him. The images were too clear not to recognize, and on top of that, the t-shirt that was on him was quite unique to spot. The very next day, an anonymous informant tips the police after recognizing the face on television, identifying him as Daniel Green Cummings. Cummings was a local with a history of felony charges registered to his name. Although his fingerprints did not hit AFIS, Cummings' fingerprints were already pre-registered in the local police files. The examination was run through,
and it was the perfect match. The earlier prints, which were found from the crime scene, were without a doubt of his. Finally, on August 29, 2002, at the Louisville Metro Police Department, the serial Daniel Green Cummings was finally brought down to the station for interrogation. Daniel had a total of 53 charged offenses to his name, which consisted of multiple counts of assault, sodomy, and burglary. In addition to related charges of burglary, robbery, illegal use of a credit card, and kidnapping, the charges were listed in 3 separate indictments that were ultimately merged. The assault incidents took place in between February 1998 through August 2002. Daniel had specks of nuisance crime recorded previously, counting in alcohol intoxication, disorderly conduct, and some pretty serious felonies. The assault cases were conducted mostly by knife point. In one specific case, he was found to be pouring bleach over a victim to destroy all the possible evidence. The victims were all different races and ranged in age from the late 20s to early 50s. Police said there is no immediate connection between Daniel and the victims, except for one common denominator. He was found to be targeting a specific portion of the society that could be perhaps called counterculture lifestyles, as reported by Sergeant Jack Jower. Daniel Cummings was arrested first during early September. He waived his Miranda rights. Detective Brian Arnold, Larry Duncan, and Will Fong were the officers appointed to the case. The questioning began as they turned on their tape recorder. The interrogation was halted in session as Daniel invoked his right to counsel. The detectives had no choice but to comply and turned off the recording. Detective Brian Arnold stayed with the assailant, while Detective Larry Duncan left the room. According to Detective Arnold, shortly thereafter, Daniel initiated a conversation with him. Arnold was hesitant to partake and respond that he didn't know if he could talk while he had already asked for a lawyer. Detective Arnold re-advised Daniel of his Miranda rights, and the whole exchange of his conversation was done off the record. Although Detective Duncan and Will Fong were keeping an ear to the whole conversation just outside the room, before long, Detective Duncan instructed Will Fong to go back into the office and question Daniel about the other charges he was suspected of committing. The tape recorder was eventually turned back on, and Daniel finally made incriminating statements, which took him out to the court.
You admit that you did those, true? It was very difficult for me because he was such a despicable character to be gentle like I try to be with most of the questioning. So it was a hardcore questioning, hard targeting questioning that went on. And you entered ground level apartment? Yes, sir. Armed yourself with a knife?
Yes, sir. I'm sitting across from a monster. This is an absolute monster who has terrified and ruined people's lives.
Assaulted the resident inside both of those apartments, isn't that true?
Later during the court trials, Daniel Cummings would move to suppress the statements. Detective Arnold and Duncan both would testify that they re-advised Daniel of his Miranda rights twice before progressing with the session, and that he waived them. The interrogation was then resumed again, but without the tape recorder. Daniel was adamant on his words that he neither confessed nor initiated in any conversation with Detective Arnold, as mentioned. There was also another alleged testimony that Detective Duncan apparently threatened him and his family while their records were kept off.
Commonwealth sentences you to 10 years in the first degree, 10 years.
At sentencing, the judge reads each count and the corresponding term of years.
10 years on each of 3 counts of sodomy in the first degree. 10 years on each of 4 counts of robbery in the first degree.
The trial court denied his appeal and testimony, focusing on the absence of any evidence of coercion, threat, or discomfort in the 175-page transcript of the interrogation. Daniel Cummings finally pled guilty with no way out after being cornered by the prosecutors. He was sentenced to 470 years of imprisonment with a $100,000 bond to his name. The relatives of the tormented victims were finally at ease, knowing that the perpetrator was behind bars and not coming out anytime soon. Though these families would forever carry the scar of such heinous acts, the detectives feel relieved that they were able to provide at least some sense of comfort to them by apprehending the culprit and letting justice prevail. Daniel's sentence lies as one of the longest throughout the history of Kentucky. And with no chance of parole anytime soon, it's safe to say that the neighborhood of Louisville can be safe and sound. The notorious case of serial Daniel Cummings is one of the most heinous crimes ever committed on the land of Louisville. It's been 22 years since then, but the pain still aches the family of the victims and their neighbors. We can only hope that there is no new similar cases coming anytime soon, as we keep our faith in the might of the law. In Northern California, on June 27, 1983, Noelle Russo, 37, the former Miss Burlingame, was out with her friend Laura Serbin, and the two friends were bar hopping like most people in the area. But as the night went on, the two friends were separated. Laura was the last person to see her before she died.
You're looking at Noelle Russo, a woman who at the age of 37 was found beaten to death and naked in this area of Rohnert Park back in 1983.
Days later, her naked and beaten body was found in an unincorporated area of Rohnert Park near Sonoma State University in California. After being cold for 40 years, the case was reopened thanks to DNA evidence. Who could commit such a heinous crime? Is there a potential revenge motive behind the beating and eventual killing? Apart from being home to Hollywood and A-listers, California is filled with breathtaking views. From the stunning coastline to the towering mountains, the scenery in California is astounding. There is a certain stereotype of people being happy-go-lucky and super friendly, which mostly stands true. Despite all the showbiz, the crime rates are high. California has seen increases in violent crimes in the years since the pandemic hit. The state's violent crime rate is up by 13.5% compared to pre-COVID rate of 2019 of 436 violent crimes per 100,000 residents. Born in San Mateo County, Noelle Russo was a lively and bright child who grew up in a loving home with her sister Irene. Not much else is known about her early life, but she was named Miss Burlingame in 1962 at the age of 16 when she won a local beauty pageant. Noelle was surprised at the win and concluded that she never thought she'd win the title and only participated to please her mother. Her aspirations were always to become a model and was keenly interested in dancing as well. A black and white photo captures the essence of Noelle from that time. A wide smile, a bouquet of flowers in hand, and a bow affixed atop her head. Her favorite sport was dancing the twist, and she enjoyed hiking. Noelle grew up to be warm, gregarious, and a real chatterbox, according to her friends. Over the course of the next 2 decades, she experienced 2 marriages followed by divorces and became a mother to a son. She briefly pursued a career as a forest ranger trainee in Colorado before eventually returning to her hometown in the Bay Area. At the time of her passing, she was enrolled at Santa Rosa Junior College. The Press Democrat newspaper called Russo a one-time teenage beauty princess. Fast forward to June 24, 1983, a night that marked the beginning of the mystery. Noelle, who was 37 years old at the time, had a fight with her boyfriend and was staying in downtown Santa Rosa with her friend. They went bar hopping like many in the area, but split up. Her friend Lauren kept trying to get a hold of her that night and the next day, but failed. Lauren told the police that Noelle planned to take a bus back to her home in Rohnert Park. Unfortunately, she never made it onto that bus. A friend recounted driving Noelle to Courthouse Square, where she intended to catch the bus. However, Noelle vanished, intercepted by an assailant before reaching her destination. On June 27, 1983, a 7-year-old boy discovered Noelle's battered body in an unincorporated area of Rohnert Park near Sonoma State University in California. On the very same day, deputies responded to a call about an unclothed deceased woman in the unincorporated region of Rohnert Park. The woman, later identified as Noelle Russo, had suffered fatal injuries from a beating. Detectives with the Violent Crime Investigations Unit began an investigation into the circumstances surrounding the murder of Miss Russo. The initial investigation faced challenges, and despite having a person of interest, the trail quickly went cold. Noelle's murder became a haunting mystery that would endure for decades. What followed were years of relentless investigation. Between 2010 and 2023, investigators submitted multiple items for forensic analysis, hoping to uncover new leads. The Santa Clara County Crime Lab and the Serological Research Institute became crucial allies in the pursuit of justice. The exact nature of the evidence leading to the suspect's arrest remains undisclosed, adding an extra layer of suspense to this unfolding narrative. Detectives worked tirelessly, conducting numerous interviews and collecting a significant amount of evidence over the years. DNA evidence linked Alfredo Quintero Jr. to Noelle Russo's homicide. On October 2, 2023, authorities executed a warrant for Quintero's arrest, taking him into custody in Lakeport. Quintero is 65 now and was an ex-boyfriend of Noelle. Quintero is booked in the main adult detention center at Sonoma County and is held without bail. Russo's family, who had endured over 4 decades of uncertainty, was alerted to Quintero's arrest. In an official statement, the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office highlighted their dedication to justice for murder victims, emphasizing that the Violent Crime Investigations Unit continues to pursue justice in cold cases. As we await further details from the ongoing investigation, one thing is clear. The persistence of investigators and advancements in forensic technology have brought us one step closer to unraveling the mysteries of the past. As we move forward, we anticipate the legal proceedings that will follow Quintero's arrest. The intricacies of the trial, from the defense attorney to the arguments presented, will become crucial chapters in this ongoing saga. Noelle Russo's family, who waited for justice for over 4 decades, now faces the prospect of closure. The arrest of Alfredo Quintero Jr. is a significant step towards that closure, a step towards healing the wounds that time alone couldn't mend. Her sister Irene was visibly upset at the news that her killer had finally been found.
She was real, and she meant the world to me. I didn't want to see the last face that you saw while she was still alive. I also want to thank the relative of the man who gave his DNA. I really appreciate it so very much. He didn't have to.
The impact of this case extends beyond the investigation room. It echoes in the reaction of Russo's family, in the memories shared by friends, and in the resilience of investigators who tirelessly pursued the truth. As we wrap up this deep dive into the mysterious murder of Noelle Russo, our thoughts are with the Russo family and all those affected by this tragic event. During the 1960s, in the United States, a period of transformation unfolded. The era was marked by significant events such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and a shift in young people's perspectives on their role in society. Alongside these changes, a new wave of feminism emerged as women rejected the traditional roles assigned to them in the 1950s and actively engaged in various spheres of life. Amidst this backdrop, 23-year-old Jane Louise Mixer found herself deeply involved. Jane was a first-year law student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 1969. She was an ardent political activist, embracing the opportunities for growth and change that this era presented. At the same time, she had recently become engaged to Phil Weitzman, who was attracted to her intellect, curiosity, burgeoning social awareness, and ambition. Jane's love for Phil burned strongly. As spring 1969 arrived, they both felt ready to announce their engagement. Jane, however, wanted to have a heartfelt conversation with her parents first, before telling them of her engagement. She believed that by sharing her thoughts and feelings, she could persuade them that their union was a positive step forward. Jane formulated a plan where she would embark on the journey home before Phil, who would join her a few days later. With the arrival of March 1969 and the impending spring break, Jane took to a college rideshare bulletin board and posted a note in search of a ride across the state to her hometown Muskegon. Over a telephone conversation with her father, Jane mentioned that she had made arrangements to travel with a fellow student named David Johnson, who had responded to her ride-sharing posting. A few days later, before Jane left home, she also spoke with her sister, Barbara, to let her in on the plan as well. Barbara was on board with the plan of Jane and Phil traveling separately. She suggested that she should travel with Phil.
However, Jane was adamant and expressed her belief that it would be more advantageous if they made the journey independently. Barbara still wasn't convinced and voiced her concerns, stating that it didn't seem safe, but Jane asked her to trust the plan. On March 20th, 1969, Jane informed her parents that she intended to depart from Ann Arbor at around 6 p.m. that same day and would arrive in Muskegon by 9:30 p.m. that evening. As the minutes turned into hours, Jane failed to turn up, and her father's worry intensified. Unable to wait any longer, around 11 p.m., he made the decision to venture out in his car, embarking on a search for his daughter. Driven by concern, he tirelessly combed the area, dedicating several hours to the quest of finding any trace of Jane. Sadly, Jane never made it home. On the evening of March 20th, 1969, Jane vanished after accepting a rideshare with a stranger to her parents' house in western Michigan for spring break. The following morning, on March 21st, 1969, a woman from a nearby home noticed a dead body in a graveyard close to her house and promptly alerted the police. Tragically, Jane's life had come to an end in an old cemetery located 14 miles from Ann Arbor. The heartless killer callously left Jane's body exposed on the grave near the cemetery gate. Local detectives from Ann Arbor, Michigan State Police, arrived at the scene at 10:30 p.m. in the morning. The air was cold and crisp, and Jane's body was still lying in the cemetery sprawled on a stranger's grave, having suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head and probable strangulation from a garrote around her neck. In a disturbing display of attention to detail, the killer had lifted Jane's jumper to reveal her underwear, placed a towel under her head, and carefully covered the body with her yellow raincoat, positioning it on top of a grave. The merciless killer had even arranged Jane's shoes and a copy of Catch-22 near the body. Although she had not been assaulted, looking at the condition of her body, the detectives could tell that she had gone through extreme horrors in her last moments. According to the medical examiner, the silk stocking found on the law student's neck had been placed after her death and did not contribute to her demise. The presence of 3 unidentified drops of sweat on the victim's pantyhose and a single drop of foreign blood on her hand served as crucial evidence. With the information at hand, detectives probed an intense investigation into Jane's murder. They started by questioning Jane's friends and family and the people who lived near the cemetery where Jane's body was discovered. Witnesses reported seeing a green station wagon speeding away from the cemetery on the night of the murder, but it was never located. The police conducted a search of Jane's dorm room and discovered a phone book with a mark next to the name David Johnson. However, the David Johnson in question, a University of Michigan student, had a solid alibi. He was performing on stage that night and denied offering Jane a ride. Law enforcement investigated other individuals named David Johnson in the area, as well as Jane's acquaintances. When they spoke to Phil, Jane's fiancé, detectives noticed an emotional detachment in Phil's demeanor. Phil defended himself by simply stating that he was too numb to really care. According to him, he was much more concerned about dealing with the death of someone he was about to get married to. Apart from the evidence found with the body, the police stumbled upon a single clue, a phone book in Jane's dormitory room with the words Mixer and Muskegon written. They suspected that the killer must have written these words, but there was no solid proof. While the investigation was in full swing, Jane was laid to rest at Restlawn Cemetery, Muskegon, Michigan. During the period when Jane was murdered, a serial killer was also at large, leaving a trail of 7 victims by the end of July 1969. The killer's reign of terror seemed unstoppable, and most of his victims went through great horrors prior to their deaths. Young women were being murdered, and despite the efforts, the perpetrator remained on the loose. Such horrific occurrences were not common in the area, and hence local campuses started implementing heightened security measures. Dormitories started to enforce checkout procedures. Eastern Michigan University implemented a curfew for all students, and the University of Michigan expanded its cross-campus bus service and added lights to major streets and walkways. Additionally, campus police had also intensified night patrols to address the growing concern. As the bodies kept on piling up, the Mixer family began losing hope of ever finding the monster that took away Jane forever. However, the community was not ready to give up yet and demanded action. Over the course of a 2-year period, starting in the summer of 1967, The University of Michigan and Eastern Michigan University in nearby Ypsilanti was shaken by a series of horrifying murders. 7 young women, residing either on or in close proximity to these campuses, met merciless fates, their lifeless bodies left in public spaces as harrowing testaments to the gruesomeness of the crimes. The tragic sequence of events began on July 9, 1967, and lasted until July 23, 1969. It wasn't until the discovery of the 7th victim that the police finally caught a break in the case. On July 31, 1969, law enforcement officials made a significant breakthrough in the case, apprehending 22-year-old John Norman Collins, an outwardly assuming student attending Eastern Michigan University. Collins, characterized by his clean-cut appearance and fraternity affiliation, was arrested in connection with the murder of the 7th victim, Karen Sue Bieneman. Karen, who was described as a cautious and sensible girl, was an 18-year-old freshman from Eastern Michigan University. She had been mercilessly strangled and left on a desolate hillside. To the university students, the arrest came as a shock. John Norman Collins was an education major at Eastern Michigan University and had no prior criminal record. A pivotal moment in the investigation came when a witness came forward claiming to have seen Collins in the company of Karen before her untimely demise. Despite widespread speculation implicating him in all 7 homicides, Collins ultimately faced trial and was convicted for just one, the murder of Karen Bieneman. The prosecution's case against him relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, painting a chilling portrait of the accused's alleged involvement in the tragic events that had gripped the community with fear and disbelief. Although Collins maintained his innocence in Karen's murder even after his conviction, he was sentenced to life in prison. He was never charged with the murder of any of the other 6 victims. Still, people in Michigan breathed a collective sigh of relief as the killings had finally come to a halt. And now that Collins would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the case of the Michigan murders seemed closed. Nonetheless, doubts persisted regarding the potential connection between Jane's murder and Collins, as it didn't quite align with the established pattern of murdering his victims. Jane's killing was different from the established pattern observed in the other cases, where victims were subjected to merciless assaults, beatings, and stabbings, indicative of a physical rage. The circumstances surrounding Jane's murder further added on to this observation. Her body, discovered on March 21, 1969, in a cemetery west of Ann Arbor, showed a deviation from Collins's typical approach. While most of his victims suffered assault, mutilation, and fatal stabbings, Jane had been strangled with a nylon stocking and shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. Despite these discrepancies, there were certain similarities between Jane's murder and some of the other victims. Notably, a woman who was killed 3 months before Jane had suffered a similar fate, being shot with a .22 caliber weapon. She was last seen in the company of Collins on the evening of her death. Moreover, common threads linked Jane's death to the others, which had been connected to Collins. The presence of garrotes, such as the stockings found around Jane's neck, echoed the methods employed in several other cases. Additionally, Jane's abduction near the university building and the subsequent discovery of her body in close proximity to where Collins's other victims were found further fueled speculation regarding a potential link. Investigators conveyed to the media a strong conviction that, although they couldn't definitively establish Collins as the perpetrator behind all the Michigan murders victims, they were confident of his involvement. Over time, the Mixer family gradually came to terms with the belief that Collins was responsible for Jane's death. As a result, a slight sense of relief washed over the community. With Collins already incarcerated, Jane's case was marked as inactive in 1970 and eventually faded, as it was never officially solved. As the years went by, decades slipped away, and the case eventually grew cold. Sergeant Eric Schroeder had long been troubled by Jane Mixer's unsolved murder, which seemed to have slipped through the cracks and been forgotten about over the years. Convinced that justice had eluded Jane, Schroeder felt a deep personal connection to her story. When Schroeder was given the task of cataloging evidence from old cases in 2001, he eagerly seized the opportunity to reopen Jane's case, determined to bring closure to her tragic story. Recognizing the advancements in forensic technology since the late 1960s, Schroeder saw the potential for DNA analysis to uncover new evidence. As a new generation of Michigan State detectives began re-examining old cases for DNA testing, Schroeder was struck by the discrepancies in the evidence surrounding Jane's murder compared to Collins's established habitual way of operating. Among the evidence cataloged was the pantyhose found on Jane's body, which Schroeder promptly sent to a forensic lab for DNA analysis. Forensic scientists meticulously examined sections of the pantyhose for possible DNA traces. Additionally, they examined Jane's clothing, the ligature used in the crime, and a blood-stained towel found beneath her head for any telltale DNA evidence. Roughly a year later, in 2002, Schroeder received an eagerly awaited call from the scientific team. Despite the lengthy passage of time, the lab had managed to unearth crucial DNA evidence. Surprisingly, however, this genetic material did not align with that of John Collins, the man who had been suspected of the murder for over 3 decades. This revelation introduced a new suspect into the spotlight of suspicion. In painstaking detail, lab technicians analyzed residue from 3 distinct drops of indistinct bodily fluid discovered on Jane's pantyhose, alongside a solitary drop of blood found on her hand from pieces of evidence that had been kept preserved over the course of more than 30 years. In the year 2004, the breakthrough emerged from the analysis of the sweat. The genetic markers from the analysis confirmed that Collins was not involved in Jane's murder and instead pointed to Gary Lederman, a retired nurse hailing from southwestern Michigan. He had dedicated his professional life to nursing. To learn more about Gary, the detectives took a closer look into his life. Gary was a 62-year-old resident of Goblaze, Michigan. Described as a bald, stout man with a passion for Civil War history, Gary was a former school board member. He was married to a Filipino woman, and together they had taken in her niece and nephew following the tragic loss of their parents and raised them as their own children. Gary had been a devoted husband for nearly 3 decades. Additionally, Gary and his wife had taken up the responsibility of taking care of Gary's elderly parents and also had generously hosted a teenage exchange student from South Korea. With Gary's involvement in various community activities, including youth sports programs, there were no signs that showed him attempting to evade detection. And even though his slate seemed clean, the test results spoke otherwise. The lab's findings indicated that the DNA recovered from Jane's pantyhose bore a striking resemblance to that of Gary Lederman. While the precise origin of the DNA remained a mystery, the police laboratory confirmed that it neither matched the blood nor other bodily fluid samples, leaving open the possibility of it being sweat, saliva, or skin cells. Nevertheless, the discovery provided law enforcement with sufficient cause to loop Gary into the murder investigation. According to Schroeder, investigators dedicated a substantial period, approximately 2.5 to 3 months, to conduct a thorough background check on Gary. Eventually, they made the decision to reach out to him directly. In the autumn of 2004, Sergeant Schroeder went to visit Gary Lederman at his residence in Goblaze, Michigan. When the police arrived at his doorstep, Gary initially didn't think much of it. At that time, he considered his life to be fairly ordinary and thought that the detectives were just on a routine check. At first glance, Gary appeared to be an unlikely suspect. However, after engaging in conversation with him for over 3 hours, the detectives delivered a stunning revelation. They informed him that his DNA had been identified on evidence from the crime scene, evidence that had remained in storage since 1969. Trying to recall the moment, Gary expressed disbelief and repeatedly questioned the detectives about what was going on. Gary adamantly asserted that he had no acquaintance with Jane Mixer. In 1969, when Jane Mixer was murdered, Gary was a 26-year-old bachelor. Having completed a 4-year stint in the Navy, he resided in a town approximately 20 miles away from Ann Arbor, the town where Jane was murdered. Originally from the outskirts of Detroit, Gary had lived in close proximity to Ann Arbor during his younger years. Following his military service, he pursued a career as a traveling pharmaceutical salesman in the region during the late 1960s. Despite relentless questioning by the police, Gary kept asserting that he was innocent and wasn't involved in Jane's murder. However, Schroeder, unconvinced by Gary's protest, cited the compelling DNA evidence against him. Subsequently, Gary was taken into custody. While he had no prior history of violent offenses, Gary harbored a couple of undisclosed secrets. In 2001, Gary had faced legal trouble for forging a prescription. During a search of his vehicle, law enforcement discovered a stash of stolen prescription blanks from the Kalamazoo hospital where he was employed. He faced charges of illegally obtaining painkillers, including Vicodin and Loracet, and attributed his actions to a struggle with addiction following a battle with kidney stones. Gary ultimately pled guilty to this crime and agreed to undergo drug rehabilitation. As a convicted felon, Gary was obligated to provide a DNA sample under a newly enacted state law, which took effect just 3 days following his conviction. This DNA test ultimately led to his arrest on suspicion of him murdering Jane Mixer. Upon delving deeper into Gary's background, authorities unearthed disturbing evidence of a darker nature. A search of his residence uncovered explicit Polaroid images of the South Korean exchange student, which showed her in compromising positions. According to prosecutors, the teenage girl appeared to be unconscious, with her clothing manipulated to expose her genitals. Despite this revelation, the girl claimed to have no recollection of the events surrounding the photographs. What was even more suspicious was that the positioning of her attire mirrored that of Jane's when her body was found. As the next step into this new investigation, police conducted interviews with the people who were acquainted with Gary at the time of the murder. One former girlfriend of Gary revealed that he exhibited peculiar erotic behavior. However, the most significant revelation came during discussions with his roommate at the time of the murder, Paul Esper. Esper disclosed to the authorities that he harbored significant suspicions regarding Gary's involvement in Jane's murder. He told the detectives how Gary eagerly awaited the prints of news articles related to the Michigan murders, only to store the clippings in a closet. Moreover, Esper recalled Gary boasting about a particular medication capable of rendering a woman unconscious with a single drop, a substance that he had access to while selling prescription drugs to hospitals. Detectives discovered a vial containing a mixture of Valium and a sedative in Gary's shaving kit, a chemical composition known to induce a deep sleep, bordering on unconsciousness. Furthermore, Esper revealed that Gary had constructed a makeshift shooting range in his basement where he regularly fired his .22 pistol. State records corroborated Esper's account, confirming that Gary had purchased a .22 caliber Ruger revolver in 1967, which he later reported stolen in 1987. Esper recalled that Gary used to insist on Esper using the range, which struck him as suspicious. Additionally, an analysis of Gary's handwriting linked the scribbled note found in Jane's phone book to Gary. Just before Thanksgiving, in November 2004, armed with compelling evidence, police apprehended Gary and he was taken into custody and held without bail. On July 11, 2005, they charged him with open murder, a charge which could lead to Gary being handed a life sentence. But what could have motivated Gary to commit such a heinous act against a woman? The manner in which her pantyhose was removed and her jumper was pulled up to expose her genitals strongly suggested a motive rooted in assault. Yet despite these indicators, there was a glaring absence of physical evidence to substantiate claims of an assault, adding to the myriad of challenges in this long-standing case. Complicating matters further, crucial evidence such as proof of assault, footprints, and fingerprints were either missing or lost, compounded by the gradual erosion of people's recollections over time. Moreover, the whereabouts of the murder weapon remained a mystery. However, perhaps the most daunting hurdle for law enforcement in providing Gary's guilt in Jane's case was the revelation that his DNA wasn't the sole genetic material recovered from the crime scene. Although the state lab confirmed a match between Gary's DNA and that found on Jane's pantyhose and silk stockings, DNA extracted from a blood spot scraped from Jane's left hand in 1969 pointed to another individual named Jana Reynolds. John was a convicted murderer, serving a life sentence in Detroit for an unrelated crime. However, it was confirmed that Jana Reynolds was merely 4.5 years old at the time of Jane's murder. How could a 4-year-old child have perpetrated such a violent act? A child of that age could not have wielded a firearm, strangled the victim with a stocking, or arranged her body in the manner it was discovered in the cemetery. The presence of a 4-year-old's blood on Jane Mixer's hand raised perplexing questions. Reynolds had killed his mother in early 2002, and the evidence from this case was being analyzed in the same lab where DNA evidence from Jane's case was being examined at the same time. The timing of the processing of the Reynolds and Mixer cases in the lab concurrently raised questions about potential contamination. Sarah Theobald, a lab technician involved in the analysis, clarified that she exclusively handled the man's clothing and never came into contact with evidence from the Mixer case. She emphasized that she adhered to strict sterile protocols, working on a sanitized surface and utilizing her own personal tools throughout the process. A few months into 2005, Gary was put on trial for the 1969 murder of Jane Mixer. Throughout the trial, Gary firmly maintained his innocence and claimed he didn't have anything to do with Jane's murder. Despite the gravity of the situation, Gary had unconditional support from his family and friends, particularly from his wife, who communicated with him frequently while he was imprisoned. Meanwhile, Jane's sister, Barbara, along with her daughter, Maggie, attended all court proceedings diligently, determined to assess the evidence firsthand. Barbara emphasized the importance of bearing witness to Jane's life and felt compelled to be present throughout the trial. As the prosecution began to present its case, they called David Johnson to the stand. David was the one who allegedly responded to Jane's note of requesting a ride back home. However, he was involved in a play on the night of the murder and testified that he had no interaction with Jane. Additionally, David said that he was unaware of her existence. Prosecutor Stephen Hiller offered his perspective on the events of that fateful March night in 1969. Hiller believed that Gary posed as David Johnson and responded to Jane's advertisement for a ride to Muskegon. Additionally, Hiller theorized that Jane accepted the ride, and at some point during the journey, Gary made an advance at Jane that escalated into a fatal confrontation. According to Hiller, on March 21, 1969, the night of the murder, Gary put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger twice. Hiller also mentioned the point that Gary owned a .22 caliber handgun, the same type used in Jane's murder. The detectives who had worked on Jane's case when her murder actually took place made earnest efforts to recollect the details of the case, including both the evidence they managed to secure and the unfortunate losses along the way. However, the pivotal turning point centered on a factor entirely unforeseen in 1969, the DNA analysis. Testimony from the fresh team of investigators who had been working on the case since 2001 focused on the discovery of 3 distinct DNA spots found on Jane's pantyhose. According to their assertions, these DNA profiles clearly pointed to Gary. Furthermore, they contended that DNA evidence from other spots on Jane's clothes yielded partial matches, further confirming his involvement. These spots included 3 additional areas on the pantyhose, traces on the blood-stained towel which was found beneath Jane's head, and marks on the nylon stocking that was wrapped around her neck. Hiller argued that the abundance of DNA evidence suggested Gary's presence at the scene of the murder, speculating that he may have been sweating while moving Jane's body. Gary, yet again, denied these accusations, asserting ignorance regarding how his DNA could have ended up in those locations. In his defense, Gary's attorney, Gary Gabry, suggested several credible explanations. He believed that there were innocent scenarios that could account for the presence of DNA. One of the possibilities suggested by the defense was incidental contact with the pantyhose in a public laundromat. Alternatively, as proposed by the expert witness, DNA transfer could have occurred during a chance encounter in a public setting, such as through a sneeze. Hiller dismissed these notions and argued that the sheer volume of DNA evidence defied innocent explanation. Hiller pointed out that the DNA was found in locations where casual contact would not suffice. He contended that there was no plausible justification for Gary Lederman's DNA to end up on Jane Mixer's pantyhose. Yet Hiller struggled to reconcile the crime lab's discovery, a blood spot on Jane Mixer's hand matching the DNA of John Rules, who was a mere 4-year-old child at the time of Jane's murder. John Rules, residing in downtown Detroit, approximately 40 miles away from the discovery site of Jane's body, remained unconnected to Gary or the victim Jane. The timing of both Jane Mixer and John Rules' cases being processed in the lab concurrently raised suspicions about potential errors within the lab procedures. Gabry contended that if an error did occur in Rules' case, it cast a doubt on the reliability of the evidence against Gary. However, Hiller stood firm with his theory that no mishaps occurred in the lab. He further backed this theory by citing testimonies from witnesses who attested to the rigorous measures implemented to maintain the integrity of all evidence and minimize the risk of errors. Lab supervisor Jeffrey Nye was called to testify as well. He asserted that he meticulously retraced every procedure and was confident that there was no contamination issue whatsoever. While Hiller's case heavily relied on DNA evidence, Gabri focused on some other factors that diverted attention away from Gary Lederman. Gabri raised questions about how John Rulis's blood ended up on Jane Mixer, acknowledging that the exact circumstances still remain shrouded in mystery. However, he insisted that the evidence unmistakably pointed to the evidence of 4-year-old Rules at the scene. Additionally, Gabri also put forth some other facts that pointed towards Gary's innocence. Gary's fingerprints had failed to match any of the unidentified fingerprints from the case, and he did not own a vehicle resembling the one that was spotted fleeing the crime scene on the night of Jane's murder. And although Gary did own a .22 caliber handgun, there was no concrete evidence that proved that the same gun was used to murder Jane. Later in 2005, the trial approached its end, and Gary never opted to take the stand himself. After 2 weeks of proceedings, the jurors began deliberating, with both families anxiously awaiting the outcome. The verdict was ultimately delivered: guilty. On July 22, 2005, the jurors, after only 4 hours of deliberation, reached a unanimous decision, convicting Gary of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the chance of parole. The courtroom fell into an emotional silence as the verdict was read out loud, leaving both families grappling with a mix of shock and sorrow. Barbara, Jane's sister, recalled feeling a sense of numbness engulfing her amidst the stunned silence, while tears echoed throughout the room. Following the announcement, Gary's wife, Sally, along with her 2 children, appeared visibly in disbelief and broke down sobbing. Jane's 91-year-old father, Dan Mixer, was also present in the court. He was overwhelmed upon hearing the verdict. Tears rolled down his eyes, but this time, he was happy that his long-gone daughter had received much-awaited justice. On August 30, 2005, Judge Donald Shelton delivered the mandatory sentence, condemning Gary to spend the remainder of his days behind bars at the Ernest C. Brooks Correctional Facility in Muskegon, Michigan. It was during this sentencing that Gary broke his courtroom silence and expressed heartfelt sympathy for the Mixer family. He acknowledged that it must have been an unimaginably difficult time for the Mixer family in 1969, grappling with the loss of their beloved Jane, yet he remained firm in his denial of being involved in Jane's murder in any way. Despite the verdict, Gary adamantly refused to accept his fate and continued to fight for his innocence until later. This kept Barbara, Jane's sister, from getting the full closure she had longed for all her life. Until Gary admits to murdering Jane, there will always be a nagging doubt about what really happened to her sister all those years ago.
I'm going to get emotional. We're always told not to get attached to a case, but you can't help it.
Marise Ann Chiverella was born on November 25, 1954, to the couple Mary and Carmen Chiverella. However, Marise never arrived at the school that morning. She vanished sometime during the half-mile trek from her home to the school. Concern mounted when she failed to appear at school and missed her customary return home for lunch. Worried loved ones promptly alerted authorities and called in all the family members to begin a search effort. Later that same day, around 1 p.m., while a man was giving driving lessons to his 16-year-old nephew near the Hazleton Municipal Airport, they stumbled upon what initially appeared to be a large doll in a coal mining pit. The man got out of the car and walked to the pit for a closer inspection. He was horrified to realize it was a lifeless body and promptly notified the police. Detectives from Pennsylvania State Police arrived at the scene and confirmed that it was Marise's body. The coal mining pit where the body was discovered was about 2 miles away from Marise's home. Tragically, Marise had been bound with one of her own shoelaces, securing her hands together, and the other binding her ankles. Her colorful scarf had been mercilessly stuffed into her mouth. Just from a quick glance, the detectives could tell that Marise had endured a harrowing assault and was ultimately strangled to death. With a heavy heart, the detectives broke the tragic news to Marise's family. Marise's family went into complete shock, and the scene at the Chiverella house turned into complete chaos. While Marise's father, Carmen, appeared numb and lost in a daze, the family doctor had to prescribe sedatives to Marise's mother, Mary, so she could better endure the pain of her 9-year-old daughter's sudden departure. While the Chiverella family was still neck-deep in sorrow, detectives had already begun investigating Marise's homicide. They learned that a few neighbors had spotted Marise walking along West 4th Street in a rush on the chilly morning of March 18th on her way to St. Joseph's School. The neighbors asked her if she needed rest and even urged her to seek refuge indoors to escape the cold. But Marise kept walking, determined to deliver the canned goods to her school before the morning mass. During the investigation conducted by the Pennsylvania State Police, the suspects included a priest with prior suspicions of involvement in a murder case in Bristol, Pennsylvania, along with a local exhibitionist. While the priest was questioned and eventually cleared, the exhibitionist, on the other hand, tragically took his own life after being requested to undergo a polygraph test. 3 days after the gruesome murder, a funeral was arranged for Marise, and she was laid to rest on Saturday, March 21, 1964, in St. Joseph Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Despite the exhaustive efforts spanning over decades, involving more than 250 members of the Pennsylvania State Police, and yielding a staggering 4,700 pages in the case file, there were no arrests in Marise's case. Eventually, the case went cold. The investigation into Marise's murder remained inactive until 2007, when advancements in forensic technology allowed the state's DNA lab to extract the suspect's DNA profile from bodily fluids found on Marise's jacket. This development sparked hope among investigators that they had finally stumbled upon the breakthrough needed to crack the case wide open. However, their optimism was short-lived when the DNA failed to yield any matches in the pre-existing databases. Not losing hope despite this setback, law enforcement officers diligently continued to cross-reference the DNA profile against records of known criminals, conducting monthly checks in the hopes of finding a match. Sadly, nothing worked. No new developments were made in the case, and Marise's killer remained unidentified until a breakthrough emerged almost 11 years later. In 2018, Pennsylvania investigators turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company renowned for its expertise in DNA analysis. Utilizing cutting-edge snapshot DNA technology, Parabon Nanolabs was able to generate a highly detailed phenotype of the killer. This phenotype provided insights into the suspect's ancestry, with descriptive details such as eye color, hair color, and other physical attributes. Armed with this invaluable information, law enforcement authorities uploaded the DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database that enabled individuals to discover their potential biological relatives. Through this approach, detectives were able to secure their first genealogical match. This match turned out to be a distant relative, possibly a sixth cousin of the suspect. Without wasting any time, the state police released composite images of a potential suspect at various ages, ranging from 25 to 60 years old, based on the comprehensive DNA analysis. Then, in 2020, genealogist Eric Schubert, a college student who was widely recognized for his expertise in genetic genealogy, reached out to the state police, offering his assistance free of charge. Schubert wrote an email to the Pennsylvania State Police detectives and asked if he was not stepping on any toes, he would like to help. Despite his young age of 18 at the time,
Schubert has done genealogy research for more than 10 years. He's assisted in other cold cases in Chicago and the Philadelphia area over the past 2 years. He came across the Chiverella case and reached out to state police,
saying, hey, I think I know what I'm doing. If I'm not stepping on any toes, I'd be happy to help. I didn't think that would work, but it did, and I'm very thankful for that. Because I knew that I could at least potentially get this case a little closer to being solved.
Schubert had already garnered a reputation for his invaluable contributions to law enforcement agencies on numerous cold cases. Having read about the ongoing efforts to solve Marise's murder in a local newspaper, Schubert felt compelled to offer his assistance. He felt confident in his abilities and wanted to contribute in any way possible. Impressed by Schubert's previous work and determination to help solve Marise's case, Pennsylvania detectives took him on board. However, prior to his collaboration with the state police to assist them with the investigation, Schubert underwent a thorough vetting process. Investigator Barron, who was the lead investigator on the Marise Chiverella case, and his partner arranged a meeting at a coffee shop located on campus premises. They discussed the case with him and made notes on how Schubert could be helpful with the homicide investigation. Towards the end of the meeting, after hearing Schubert's insights, the detectives walked away convinced that Schubert knew what he was doing. It revitalized the team and gave their investigative efforts a newfound vigor and optimism. From that point onward, the investigation charged ahead with unwavering determination. Schubert began by contacting Detective Barron via office phone calls, which later transitioned to text messages, and then eventually to cell phone calls. However, what truly stood out was the remarkable volume of emails with information about various leads he sent. Once the detectives started trusting his expertise, Schubert remained in constant communication without hesitation. Schubert described the process of utilizing genealogy to track down a killer as an exhaustive exercise in elimination. Since the state police had already uploaded the crime scene sample to the genealogy website, it gave them a huge pile of potential leads. Then, in 2020, Schubert undertook extensive research to identify possible relatives of these suspects and forwarded his findings to Detective Barron. Then, Detective Barron would closely pursue each lead and eliminate suspects through DNA analysis. Over the next 2 years, authorities meticulously conducted a plethora of interviews and diligently collected DNA samples from the families under investigation. Schubert continued to request additional DNA samples and closely examined distant genetic matches throughout the extensive 2-year investigation. It all seemed like a huge puzzle to Schubert, but he was not going to stop until he found the culprit in Marise's case. Devoting as many as 20 hours per week outside his college schedule for a staggering 18 months, Schubert methodically sifted through every potential lead until his focus narrowed in on a local bartender named James Paul Forty in early 2022. Forty had never been considered a suspect in Marise's homicide until now. The most challenging task for Schubert was zeroing in on Forty amidst the construction of these elaborate family trees, and subsequently targeting those particular family lineages. Initially, the massive number of DNA samples available played a pivotal role in narrowing down the list of suspects to 4 individuals. However, Forty's profile attracted particular attention due to his prior criminal history.
So using the samples we obtained, we narrowed potential suspect list down to 4 individuals. One of those individuals had been arrested in 1974 by the Pennsylvania State Police. I believe it was Trooper Geib, who couldn't make it today. He was arrested for involuntary deviant intercourse, sexual assault, and aggravated assault. The same person who was also arrested by Hazleton City Police Department in 1978 for reckless endangerment and harassment. Armed with this information and the ability to eliminate the other 3 suspects, we found our main suspect.
Employing his expertise, Schubert crafted approximately 50 comprehensive family trees in search of a connection to Hazleton. Eventually, he traced Forty's lineage back to a man who had immigrated from Italy to Hazleton in 1904. This man was Forty's grandfather. Schubert then diligently sought out descendants who had resided in the Hazleton area at the time of Marise's tragic demise. Eventually, Forty and his brother emerged as prime suspects. However, both of them were now deceased. Fortunately, when investigators located the brother's widow, she provided an old hairbrush belonging to her late husband. A DNA test of that conclusively ruled Forty's brother out, thus leaving James Paul Forty as the sole remaining suspect. The lead concerning Forty proved to be sufficiently convincing, prompting a legal process to obtain approval for the exhumation of his remains. Given Forty's status as unmarried and childless, the exhumation was deemed necessary to secure a DNA sample for an accurate comparison with the suspect's genetic profile. On January 6, 2022, Forty's body was exhumed to obtain the DNA sample required for comparison with the one found on Marise's jacket almost 58 years ago. Following a deep forensic analysis, DNA extracted from clothing worn by Marise on the day of her tragic demise yielded a positive match to Forty's genetic profile on February 3, 2022. The statistical improbability of the DNA not belonging to him was exceedingly low, and hence confirmed his involvement in the crime. Collaborating closely with the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office, investigators conclusively identified Forty as the perpetrator behind Marise's untimely death. James Paul Forty, a Hazleton native, had worked as a bartender and bar supplies salesman in the area. He was born and raised in Hazleton and spent his entire life in the town. At the time Forty murdered Marise, he was 22 years old and resided only 6 to 7 blocks away from Marise's residence. He had no known familial or social connections to her family. However, Forty's past was scarred by instances of violence, as evidenced by prior arrest on charges ranging from public indecency and assault to reckless endangerment and harassment. In 1980, at the age of 38, Forty passed away reportedly due to a heart attack while on duty at the bar where he worked. On February 12, 2022, law enforcement announced the identification of James Paul Forty as the perpetrator responsible for the assault and murder of Marise Ann Chiverella while she was on her way to school in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Officials confirmed that Forty had not been implicated in the initial homicide investigation. During the press conference, authorities disclosed details from their interview with the victim, whom Forty assaulted back in 1974. The victim described the traumatic event as the most violent encounter of her life. Police highlighted the possibility that this incident might not have been Forty's sole offense, and urged individuals with relevant information to step forward. The hunt for Marise's killer spanned multiple generations of state police investigators, with over 230 department members involved in the investigation at various points. However, Forty's name did not surface until the very end. Detectives also shared that Marise's murder stood as Pennsylvania's oldest cold case and the 4th oldest in the nation to be resolved through genetic genealogy.
Even though it took nearly 58 years for this case to be solved, I think that this should instill in the families of victims across the state and across the country a sense of hope.
Present at the emotionally charged press conference were officials responsible for advancing the case over several decades and members of the Chiverella family, including Marise's brother, Ronald. Ronald said now that he and his family knew who the murderer of his little sister was, there was a sense of closure for everybody. Even though the Chiverella family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of Marise's absence, knowing that the person who did this was no longer around and wouldn't be doing this to any other young girls brought them peace. Marise may have been gone for decades, but the loving memories of her would linger on forever in the lives of the Chiverella family. Marise's parents, Mary and Carmen, never wanted revenge or punishment, but only justice, and justice had been finally served. Sadly, neither of Marise's parents were alive to see that happen. They never got a chance to learn who took their daughter away from them. Carmen Chiverella, Marise's father, passed away in 2006, and Mary Chiverella, Marise's mother, in 2014. They were buried side by side next to their long-gone daughter, Marise, at St. Joseph Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery in their hometown of Hazleton, Pennsylvania. David Tyll, born on August 21, 1958, and Brian Ognjan, born on January 16, 1958, shared a deep bond forged through their childhood days in Detroit, Michigan, where they first crossed paths as Boy Scouts. From childhood to adulthood, they remained inseparable, engaging in various activities like card games, hunting expeditions, and outdoor adventures. Brian, employed as a mechanic, and David, a skilled machinist, were both 27 years old in 1985, when they embarked on a journey that would forever alter their fate. On November 22, 1985, David and Brian were on their way to David's family hunting cabin in White Cloud, Michigan, where they planned to go deer hunting. Earlier that day, David commenced the journey by picking up Brian from his home in St. Cloud Shores. After Brian cashed a $50 check, they departed on their trip. Initially, they aimed to visit a friend in Mio, located 150 miles to the east, before heading to the hunting grounds near David's family cabin. Unfortunately, the best friends never arrived at either the friend's residence or the hunting cabin. Despite their plans, they mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Authorities could figure out no plausible motive for David and Brian to vanish willingly. Although there was no proof that David and Brian arrived at the hunting cabin in White Cloud that night, a number of witnesses reported spotting them and their Bronco at a tavern in Mio, suggesting that an incident may have occurred there.
After the hunters have been in the woods, that they've not come across a vehicle, that they've not come across a weapon, anything that would lead you to believe that they got lost or something happened that was accidental, then you're pretty sure that they met some type of foul play.
Both men were Caucasian, with David working as a machinist and Brian as a mechanic. Their absence from their respective homes on Sunday night and failure to report to work on Monday, November 25, 1985, raised alarm among their families, as they were known for their reliability. In the following days and weeks, their families took proactive measures, reaching out to the media and law enforcement agencies, distributing flyers featuring David and Brian's photos as well as David's Bronco. Their families even enlisted TV stations to broadcast descriptions of both the men statewide. David was described as having brown hair, green eyes, and a beard, while Brian had sandy brown hair, brown eyes, and a mustache. With their details and descriptions being widely circulated, David and Brian became the subjects of numerous false sightings, particularly in the White Cloud area. However, David's father, along with other family members at the cabin, knew they had not arrived at their destination. A man residing northwest of Mio confirmed seeing David and Brian, who sought directions to a friend's home near Luzerne on Friday, November 22, 1985. Despite this lead, when the detectives reached out to their friend, he told the detectives that David and Brian never arrived at his place. The friend was even made to undergo a lie detector test to affirm his credibility, which he passed. Further investigation revealed sightings of David and Brian in bars and diners across Mio during the weekend they vanished. However, authorities could not determine where they spent their nights or ascertain the exact timing of their disappearance, whether it occurred on Saturday or Sunday night. With no traces leading to David or Brian, and without proof of any foul play, the investigation into David and Brian's mysterious disappearance lost pace over the years, and the case eventually went cold. However, in 1990, investigators received a crucial tip from an informant regarding the night David and Brian disappeared. According to the informant, the two best friends had visited Linker's Lounge near Mio, where they got heavily drunk and eventually became involved in a physical altercation with another group, including two brothers, Junior Raymond Duvall, commonly known as JR, and Donald Duvall, also known as Coco.
They made the remark, you should have seen the expression on one of them's face when we did the other one. And they had made the remark that they had fed them to the pigs.
Despite this lead, authorities lacked sufficient evidence to proceed until 1999, when Detective Lesneski uncovered a crucial witness, Barbara Boudreau, who had been holding on to a secret for far too long. In early 1999, Barbara and her friend Ruth Fawcett had been having drinks. As the two women laughed and discussed their lives, Barbara decided to let Ruth in on a secret. Barbara revealed that she witnessed what happened to David and Brian all those years ago in 1985. Ruth was immediately taken aback and asked Barbara to inform the police about it. However, she expressed reluctance to cooperate with the police out of fear for her safety. Recognizing the significance of Barbara's information, her friend Ruth alerted the investigators herself, including Detective Lesneski. Although Ruth was unable to provide Barbara's exact address, she provided a general location to the authorities. Armed with this information, Detective Lesneski embarked on a door-to-door search, eventually arriving at Barbara's secluded residence in the woods on March 5, 1999. Despite more than 13 years having passed since the two men disappeared, Lesneski's persistence led him to be the first person to locate and question Barbara. Upon realizing the purpose of Lesneski's visit, Barbara was overcome with fear and began shaking so intensely that the Detective Lesneski feared she might be experiencing an epileptic seizure. In a panic, she kept screaming at Detective Lesneski, ordering him to leave or she would be killed. Barbara even attempted to slam the door shut, but Lesneski swiftly blocked it with his foot and gently made his way inside, while offering words of reassurance. Despite her continued trembling and tears, Barbara kept saying the same thing over and over again, that Lesneski was going to get her killed and that he needed to leave her residence. He begged her to help and said he would solve the murders even if it took the rest of his life. Though Barbara sensed his sincerity, she initially disclosed only the events at the bar and mentioned hearing screams later that night in the woods near her house. Lesneski sensed that Barbara was withholding crucial information and he needed to gain her trust to get the full story from her. He spent nearly 2.5 years building her trust through various acts of assistance, such as repairing her roof, chopping firewood, and repairing a fence. It wasn't until 2003 that Barbara finally agreed to sit down for a thorough interrogation. During the session, she paused, turned off Lesniewski's tape recorder, and uttered, "You knew I was there, don't you? You know I saw everything." She then proceeded to recount the harrowing details of the tragic fates of David and Brian, witnessed by her and a long-gone friend of hers.
When I went to the Attorney General, I was sworn to tell the truth, which I did, sort of, until near the end, and I said, you know, I can never tell you the whole truth. And they shut the tape down, and I looked at Bronco, and I said, you know I know.
She recalled the time she spent at Linker's Lounge on that fateful night when David and Brian vanished. She remembered that she was in the company of her friend, Ronnie Emery, and the two of them had been playing pool and having drinks. They were there to celebrate Ronnie's first successful hunt. Amidst the joy of celebration, Barbara noticed two drunk men causing a disturbance in the lounge. They were David and Brian, who were having a loud argument with other patrons. Just moments after that, Donald and Raymond Duvall walked in accompanied by another individual, and tensions escalated after a confrontation with David and Brian. There was an unpleasant exchange of words and actions that followed. Feeling that the situation would spiral out of control, Barbara intervened and threatened to call law enforcement. Things seemed to settle down, but that was only for a short while. Eventually, Barbara and Ronnie decided to leave and head back to her nearby residence. However, their evening took a sinister turn when they heard alarming sounds coming from the woods right next to her home. Barbara and Ronnie could hear screams, shouts, and metallic pings echoing through the night. Intrigued and somewhat apprehensive, Barbara and Ronnie sneaked out through the back door to not draw any attention and ventured into the woods. Their journey through the snow-covered landscape led them to a chilling scene. A group of men gathered in a clearing, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the moon and the harsh glare of truck lights. Among them, Raymond and Donald Duvall appeared engaged in a heated exchange, their voices carrying across the field in the dead of night. It was a moment frozen in time, forever etched in Barbara's memory as a night of both mystery and terror. During her testimony, Barbara recalled a traumatic scene where the two men restrained Brian while others mercilessly assaulted David.
Barb said she could hear these pings and it sounded like an aluminum bat hitting a softball.
Donald Duvall, armed with an aluminum baseball bat, unleashed a barrage of savage blows upon David, who pleaded desperately for mercy amidst his screams and agonizing attempts to evade the bat swings. The sickening sound of the bat hitting David's head echoed through the air until the hits on David's skull started to sound like a pumpkin shattering upon concrete. As the violence unfolded, Brian managed to break free momentarily, only to be caught and ruthlessly dragged back to the field by his assailants, who taunted him for his terror-induced loss of control. They subjected him to a relentless barrage of kicks, blows, and strikes until his resistance faded, and he succumbed to their merciless attacks. With both victims incapacitated, their attackers, Raymond and Donald Duvall, callously loaded their lifeless bodies into a vehicle, prompting Ronnie and Barbara to flee in terror back to her residence. Their escape, however, did not shield them from the ominous threat that soon followed. A mysterious visitor, unknown to Barbara, arrived at her door and delivered a chilling warning that would leave her scared for the rest of her life. The man said, "You didn't see anything, and you don't know anything. If you ever open your mouth, you'll be killed. Pigs gotta eat too." In the years that followed, the Duvalls occasionally stopped by Barbara's house to repeat their threats and make sure that she remained silent. Their visits grew more frequent whenever the investigation heated up. Living in constant fear for the next 18 years, Barbara harbored her secrets and revealed them only to a select few, including Smith, a sheriff's deputy with whom she had shared a romantic relationship in the past. Despite her attempts to seek solace and validation, Smith treated Barbara's revelations with skepticism and dismissal, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. However, with the truth finally laid out, Barbara felt as if a huge burden had been lifted off her chest. And now that Barbara's long-held silence was shattered, there was a chance that the perpetrators would be brought to justice, offering a glimmer of closure amidst the shadows of the past. After Barbara's confession, numerous witnesses stepped forward, each adding another layer of horror to the tragic tale of David and Brian's demise. According to these accounts, Raymond and Donald Duvall were not only responsible for the merciless murders, but also callously bragged about their grisly actions. Some witnesses spoke of chilling conversations where the Levall brothers boasted about dismembering the victims and disposing of their bodies by feeding them to pigs. Others recounted verbal threats made by Raymond, warning of similar fates for those who dared to speak out against them. One witness, Raymond's son's girlfriend, shared a particularly disturbing encounter, detailing how Raymond had not only confessed to the killings, but had also issued threats against her safety. Similarly, Donald's girlfriend at the time revealed terrifying confessions made in moments of rage, accompanied by violence and manipulation to maintain her silence. Additionally, multiple witnesses recalled seeing another Levall brother, Rex, driving David's Bronco in the days following the murders, adding yet another layer of suspicion to the already sinister narrative. These testimonies painted a grim portrait of the Levall brothers, depicting a history marred by a wide spectrum of their criminal activities, ranging from poaching to murder, further underscoring the depth of depravity lurking within their family. Another Levall brother asserted that although he claimed not to have committed the killings himself, he aided in the transportation of the victims' bodies. Moreover, suspicions arose surrounding yet another member of the Levall family, Kenny, who allegedly dismantled David's Bronco and sold its parts for profit. Kenny's involvement was detailed in a recorded interview with law enforcement, yet during his testimony in court, he conveniently suffered from what appeared to be selective memory loss. Raymond and Donald were charged and arrested in 2003 and faced trial for murdering David and Brian in October of the same year, despite taking the stand to proclaim their innocence and assert they had no acquaintance with the victims. The weight of evidence, including Barbara's testimony and the statements of 6 other witnesses, proved decisive. Consequently, the Levall brothers were found guilty of first-degree murder and handed life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. In January 2004, a poignant memorial service was held at St. Raymond's Church in Detroit to honor the memories of both David and Brian, providing solace and closure to the grieving loved ones and community members alike. Tragically, the remains of neither David nor Brian have ever been recovered, nor have their personal belongings, including wallets, identification documents, luggage, and David's 1980 Ford Bronco. Barbara's disclosures also suggest the involvement of at least 3 additional individuals in the assault on the victims, though no further charges have been brought against anyone else implicated in the case.